Good morning and welcome to the 17th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2025. Apologies been received from Monica Lennon, and so I'm welcoming Sarah Boyack, who's attending as her substitute. Our first item of business this morning is a decision on taking item 6 in private. Item 6 is the consideration of the evidence we will hear on the hydrogen aspects of Project Willow, the Project Willow study. Are we agreed to take that in private? We are agreed. The second item of business this morning is the first of 2 days of evidence taking this month on the plans for the future of Grangemouth. Refining has ceased and the UK and Scottish governments are looking for new uses for the site as a green energy hub. The Project Willow study, which is supported by both UK and Scottish governments, was published in March with 9 proposed projects, 4 of which in some way relate to the production of hydrogen, and we'll be discussing those today. This is an opportunity to touch more widely on the prospects for a thriving and competitive hydrogen sector in Scotland, which to some extent lies behind any aspirations for Grangemouth to be a green hub in the future. Today we'll be hearing from 2 panels of witnesses, and the first panel of witness I'm pleased to welcome John Anderson, Professor in Energy Systems, School of Engineering and Physical Science at Heriot-Watt University, Dr Graham Hawker, Chancellor's Fellow in Future Energy Systems, University of Strathclyde, and Dr Nigel Holmes, the Chief Executive Officer for Hydrogen Scotland. Good morning, and thank you for attending. And we'll go straight into the questions. And as normal, I have the easy question to ask at the beginning. That one is just that Project Willow doesn't advocate the use of either green or blue hydrogen, that only a reliable source of hydrogen will be required, low carbon hydrogen required. Which of these production methods do you think is going to offer the most reliable and affordable supply of hydrogen in Scotland? And we'll start on the right. Nigel, do you want to kick off with that, and then I'll go across the whole panel on it?
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to give evidence today. So, just very quickly as introduction, I head up Hydrogen Scotland. We are the trade association for hydrogen activities in Scotland. We have members including industry, academia, local authorities, city authorities, and we work very closely with Scottish Enterprise. To answer the question, green or blue, I'm often accused of being sat on the fence on this one. We have members who work on both green hydrogen projects and blue hydrogen projects. I think one of the best examples would be Storegga, who've been developing project Acorn in St Fergus, and also been very closely involved with the Speyside hydrogen project in Speyside. And to answer the question about the security of supply and the affordability, the production of blue hydrogen from natural gas with carbon capture, as long as you have a supply of natural gas, you can actually pretty much guarantee the supply of blue hydrogen. With green hydrogen, production from renewables, usually via the grid, the supply of energy for the production of hydrogen is actually dependent on the availability of that electricity. Now, if you're on the grid and there's always electricity available, then you can pretty much guarantee green hydrogen all of the time. If you are using the hydrogen production to overcome intermittency in renewables or constraints on the power transmission system, then the availability of the hydrogen may be variable along with the wind or indeed solar in some cases. So then the affordability of green hydrogen, one of the big questions, is actually very much about the cost of the electricity. So the cost of green hydrogen is almost 75 or 80%, I've heard, is the impact of the electricity cost. So if you can keep the electricity costs down, and this is one of the big discussions at the moment about local pricing of electricity and how that might affect hydrogen production. If you can keep the price of electricity down, then you can keep the price of the green hydrogen down. There's various studies out there trying to predict how the cost of green and blue hydrogen will change. Nearly all of them are predicting the cost of green hydrogen to come beneath that of blue hydrogen. The question is when. Is it going to be 2030, 35, 40, or whatever. And again, that will depend on your location and the price of the electricity.
Thank you. Just before I come to you, Graham, because you mentioned Storiga and the fact that it's got a planning application in Speyside, I have an interest in the River Spey in a fishery. So just in case there's any doubt, I have no interest in Storiga, but just so people know that there is some tenuous connection between Storiga, the Spey and myself. So Graham, over to you.
Good morning, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'll perhaps be a little bit less on the fence than Nigel and say that I think there is a very particular opportunity around green hydrogen within Scotland, predominantly because it aligns so well with the wind targets that we have. There is a substantial ambition for offshore wind in Scotland, combined with the issue that there is not a huge amount of demand for electricity in Scotland. So we have to put into context that we're looking for 11 gigawatts of offshore wind, which is more than double the peak electricity demand in Scotland. And at the same time, we have significant network constraints that mean that a lot of this energy is currently underutilised, cannot be translated to where it can be used in other parts of Britain. And even if we do catch up with the growth in renewable energy through the build-out of more electricity network, we still reach a point in the 2030s where even if we had infinite network capacity, there will still be excess renewable energy on the system. So it seems to me that within the Scottish context, there is a huge potential alignment between offshore wind targets in particular and the potential for a growth of the green hydrogen sector. That's not to say blue hydrogen doesn't have its part to play. When projects like Acorn were first being discussed, the original concept was that blue hydrogen would be seen as a bridging technology. So at the time, green hydrogen was seen as substantially more expensive than blue hydrogen and would not be at all economically viable for some years, decades even. So hence blue hydrogen was seen as the bridge across that gap, but would still at some point give way to green hydrogen as the predominant form of hydrogen production. It's now been some 10, 15 years since that kind of view was in place, and there has been no great growth of the blue hydrogen sector, whereas we have seen huge reduction in costs of electrolyzers, scaling up of modular systems, and that means the gap in costs has started to come down significantly. However, there is still, as Nigel has pointed out, the fact that green hydrogen production is still exposed to very high electricity costs that don't fully represent the opportunity that exists for renewable energy. So I would sit firmly on the using blue hydrogen where necessary to get the hydrogen economy moving, but that the long-term view should still be as green hydrogen as the backbone. However, I would also conclude that by saying that the 5 gigawatt target by 2030 greatly implies that we make use of both. We're not going to get to that point unless we do pretty much everything that's on the table at the moment.
Okay, John.
So I'm a chemical engineer from Harry-Watt University, so I'm kind of color agnostic about the hydrogen. However, if you look at blue hydrogen and you want to use it for heat and electricity, most likely combined heat and power is much more efficient than blue hydrogen, if that's the purpose of it. And also, if you look at the growth prospect of the hydrogen, most likely green hydrogen has the best growth prospect as I see it. If you look at the wind potential in Scotland, probably one of the biggest in Europe, with the ScotWind, for example, being 28 gigawatt. Most of that is going to produce all year round. Most likely in winter you will use that electricity for heat pumps, for example, but during late spring, summer and autumn, you will need to store that electricity because it's got to be produced but not consumed. So the hydrogen is probably the only answer Scotland has to do that storage. If you look at other countries around Europe which have high renewable content, for example Denmark has high renewable content, they have a surplus of biomass and they use biomass for their CHP and a lot of district heating, a lot higher population density than Scotland. If you go to Norway, for example, which is virtually 100% electrified, they have a 5 times larger electric network than Scotland has. However, they store their energy during summer and early autumn in terms of water. So I think what Scotland needs to do is find a way to store the excess wind capacity, as was said by Graham and Nigel as well. And I think green hydrogen will be my choice in terms of how to do that.
Okay, thank you. Just so I understand, Nigel, the comment you made about the cost. My understanding, and I seem to remember reading that to create hydrogen from electricity, you lose about 40% of the power in transferring it to hydrogen, and then a further 10% transferring it back to electricity. Are those figures correct? That's the first point. And the second point is that if you're using hydrogen to get the same effect as electricity, how much more or how much less, I think it's how much more you're paying for hydrogen than you would be for electricity?
Right. So there are various stages in the production of hydrogen and then turning it back into the useful energy at the point where you use it. And the general sort of performance of the electrolysis stage, so this is the place where you're actually converting the electricity into the hydrogen, is reckoned to be about 65 to 70% efficient. So you have 25 to 30% losses, typically coming off as heat. That then can be transmitted via the power networks with the same efficiency as you would transmitting electricity. No. The transmission of, if you're moving the hydrogen from where you, so let me go back. There's a very, very simple but quite useful phrase to remember with hydrogen. Make it, move it, store it, use it. Why is that important? Because often the place where you make the hydrogen is not the location where you might use the hydrogen. Take the example of Acorn. You're making the hydrogen in St Fergus. You could be moving that hydrogen down to the central belt. We're talking about Project Willow. That's one of the users of hydrogen. And Graham's already mentioned some of the need to move electricity around the UK. And the challenge with the power networks is the availability of the capacity on the power networks. And that compares with actually the potential to use pipelines, for example, to move hydrogen. So a typical big power transmission connection could be 1 or 2 gigawatts. A nice big pipe could be 10 or 20 gigawatts. And the energy losses, when you actually move the hydrogen down a pipe, are probably comparable with that of the power networks, maybe slightly less. But it means that you can move hydrogen quite long distances without loss of a lot of efficiency. Why does that matter? Because it comes back to the point already mentioned. It's the price of the electricity that really determines the cost of the hydrogen. So if you can locate the hydrogen production close to the point of renewables, so in Scotland, that could be in the north of Scotland, where you can access the offshore wind and the onshore wind. You can then produce the hydrogen at a low cost. It may even be without going through the grid connections. It could be an off-grid system, which would further reduce the cost. And that means you get a lower cost of hydrogen than you would do if you moved the electricity. Let's, for the sake of argument, say that with Project Willow, you put all of the hydrogen production adjacent to the INEOS Grangemouth site. The cost of the electricity in Grangemouth would probably be significantly higher than the cost of electricity in the north of Scotland. So I don't know if this is answering your question. There's 2 parts here. One is about the efficiency, the other is about the cost. And so the efficiency might be the same with the power network transmission and the pipeline transmission, but the cost of the end product could be significantly less if we deliver the hydrogen via pipeline. Does that help to answer?
It kind of answers the question, but once you put the electricity into the national grid, you'll get onto a national pricing structure for it, even if it goes to an electrolyser. What I'm trying to work out in my mind is to achieve X with electricity, just say will cost you £1. To achieve X with hydrogen, how much is that going to cost you? What's the difference? How much more are you going to have to pay for hydrogen? Because I'm told you will have to pay more for hydrogen than you will for electricity.
So that is true if you are making and using the hydrogen and the electricity all in the same place. If you are, for example, if you're producing the hydrogen, let's use another example, which is in the north of Scotland, the proposed Kintor project, Statera, the half-gigawatt project. The plan for Kintor was to move their hydrogen down by pipeline to Grangemouth, where it would be used. To produce the hydrogen in Kintor would probably cost half what it would cost to produce it in Grangemouth, because the price of electricity would be less. The delivered cost in Grangemouth, if you have that combination of Kintor production and pipeline, the delivered cost of the hydrogen in Grangemouth could be half that by pipeline that it would be made in Grangemouth. Now, these are just examples, so please, when you come to write up the evidence, don't take this as an absolute statement. But it's just to show that where you have access to low-cost electricity, you can make low-cost hydrogen, and you can move that low-cost hydrogen by pipeline without much additional cost. So that means that in Grangemouth, the delivered cost of energy as hydrogen from Kintor by pipeline would be half that of the price of making the hydrogen in Grangemouth, for the sake of argument. So the cost of the hydrogen on an energy basis in Grangemouth could be less than the cost of electricity in Grangemouth. That would be possible.
But if it was made in Grangemouth, the hydrogen, it would be more expensive.
Absolutely. If you have, unless you've got a way of accessing, so you might be able to play tricks with the power cost at different times, so you start to do essentially grid balancing through the electrolysers. What we have with hydrogen is the ability to essentially time shift supply of electricity and demand for electricity, and we have the opportunity to, by location, shift energy from one place to another at large scale. That is the key attribute of hydrogen, as a low energy vector which has storability and transportability.
And I think that's why it seems attractive to me, especially if it gets rid of constraint payments and such like, which I think are a complete anathema to people who use electricity. But, okay, next question, very simply. I think you said, all of you have said that, that blue and green will be available. So which one is, if we're going to make these changes at Grangemouth, which one will we have to rely on most to start with? And do you see it changing over a short period of time or a long period of time? So, John, do you want to start with you?
I mean, in Grangemouth, you already have a steam heating reforming there, which is the largest, I believe, in Scotland. So that will be an easy swap if that hardening is not needed for the refining that you have in Grangemouth. In terms of the conversion efficiency you said about hydrogen, you have to remember that in a refinery, you use around 20 to 25% of the energy in gasoline or petrol and diesel to actually make it. So the hydrogen production efficiency is very much similar to what you have in a refinery anyhow. So you will need something to convert it.
Okay. Graham?
I don't think there's a clear case either way, because whichever solution is involved has implications for the level of storage and transport networks that you need. There is, as I think John pointed out, there is a case for blue hydrogen in that would initially give a more direct, continuous supply of hydrogen rather than being subject to the variability of renewable energy. However, there are a large number of developers sitting on seabed rights for offshore wind who are very, very keen to find a route to accessing the hydrogen market, to be able to start producing green hydrogen, and would also be able to invest in storage as a result of the low marginal cost of their production. So I think either line can be taken as supporting that early growth of Grangemouth.
Nigel, you said you backed both horses in this race, so are you sticking to that?
Yes, but for maybe slightly different reasons. So, again, Grangemouth, I actually worked at Grangemouth for 15 years for BP in the chemicals area. So one of the key things that happened when I was there was that the refinery and the chemicals plant became much more integrated. And there's a number of processes where byproducts from the chemicals plant went over the fence and were used in the refinery and vice versa. One of those was hydrogen. The chemicals plants included the ethylene cracker, which is one of, I think, just 2 left in the UK. There's Grangemouth and there's Mossmoran. And that makes a building block for chemicals and plastics production, ethylene. And in that process, it produces a byproduct of hydrogen. And so the refinery was actually benefiting from a lot of the hydrogen coming from the ethylene cracker. Now, obviously, the refinery is closing down. That hydrogen will probably be used instead to help to fuel the cracker, as it is already at Mossmoran. But the ambition with the crackers is to actually further decarbonise them with more electricity, with more hydrogen produced by green hydrogen from electricity. But at the same time, these processes have byproducts coming off them which don't necessarily have markets. These are hydrocarbon products without markets. And at the moment, the steam methane reformer that's used at Grangemouth actually has the capability to take different byproducts and to reuse them, reprocess them into things that are useful, including hydrogen. So there is a function for a blue hydrogen type process, which is actually using up products that otherwise would be wasted as part of those activities. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, the Acorn project in St Fergus could also be part of the supply into Grangemouth. So access to secure supplies of natural gas from the North Sea, so you're not having to import LNG to produce that blue hydrogen. And that gives us one of the lowest carbon footprints of blue hydrogen. So we have to remember that the footprint of blue hydrogen is mostly about the CO2 produced in the process, but there's all the emissions associated with the production and transportation of LNG, which, if it's used as a feedstock, is got a much higher footprint than locally produced gas that gets transported via pipelines. Does that help?
Ish. Mark, I think you've got a follow-up question, and then I'm going to come to Kevin because you've got one as well.
I'm interested in the definition of blue hydrogen as low carbon, and obviously that is dependent on CCS being in place, CCS working at a certain efficiency. So I'm interested in whether you see that as achievable. Given Acorn has not yet been constructed, and whether the kind of capture rates that are predicted for Acorn, whether that's been replicable in other CCS commercial plants elsewhere around the world. So how much certainty is there that if Acorn happens, that what you'll end up with is blue hydrogen, and it will be a low carbon product? Or is there some uncertainty there around, what eventually comes out of that process being low carbon enough?
I can't remember. So I'm not the expert on carbon capture storage. That's probably evidence that would better come from somebody else. But when we look at the carbon footprint, it's important not just to look at the CO2 that's being produced, or indeed any CO2 that's being released as part of the process, but to look at the supply chain for the feedstock, so the natural gas. And LNG in particular has quite an intensive, energy-intensive production process. LNG from fracked gas has an energy-intensive process, but with other challenges around it, compared to natural gas from the North Sea, which basically comes straight out of the field into a pipe into St Fergus. So my suggestion is that actually the biggest uncertainty is around those the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the supply of the natural gas, rather than the difference between maybe a 90%, 99% CO2 capture on the process.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is that okay, Mark? Is that sorry, Kevin? Over to you.
Thank you, convener, and good morning. Dr. Hawker and others have mentioned storage and transportation. Is the current situation where the UK government has failed thus far to update storage and transport regulations, creating uncertainties which may hold up our move towards hydrogen in Scotland and the rest of the UK? Dr. Hawker, please.
I would say that from the perspective of the upstream producers, absolutely there is uncertainty in exactly how they are going to get their product through a system of transportation and storage to end users. And part of that can be the incorporation into a national scale system, so the availability of a large scale transmission network and cavern storage, for which there isn't, as you say, yet a clear route in place. However, when we're talking about an early nascent hydrogen system, we are perhaps looking more at smaller scale storage, above ground storage, smaller scale pipelines on a local basis, which the technology exists, the route to market can be fairly clear if there is a match made between upstream producers and end off-takers such as Grangemouth.
So, in practical terms, maybe turn to Dr. Holmes, but you can come in as well, Dr. Hawker, if you wish. You mentioned Kintore to Grangemouth. Obviously, that would have to be piped. How do regulations stand at this moment in time to allow for that transportation down a pipeline?
So the point about pipelines is critical to the supply of hydrogen at scale. So when you start off with small hydrogen production, sort of 1 megawatt, 10 megawatts of production, so that those are the scales looked at for Aberdeen, for Orkney, for
Sure.
the Whiteley project just south of Glasgow. Tube trailers are perfectly fine. You can move those quantities around. Once you get over about 100 megawatts, the number of tube trailer movements would get very challenging. So pipelines become really important.
Sure.
But pipelines can be expensive. So if you want to lay new pipelines, the cost of doing a pipeline from Scotland to Germany has been estimated at about £3.5 billion. Big pipeline, long distance. But the good news is that there are various pipelines available, potentially, in the future, as we start to decommission gas networks, as we start to develop Project Willow would be another one. And between Kintore and Grangemouth, there is, I believe, a gas feeder pipeline, which is currently being used, but it could be repurposed. Big discussion around could that happen. Two approaches worth considering here. One is where a pipeline gets completely repurposed from natural gas duty, so 100% natural gas to 100% hydrogen. That is in many ways the simplest approach. The other is where you start to blend a certain amount of hydrogen into the natural gas.
Sure.
So it's a bit like having sort of ethanol in petrol. You blend in maybe 5%.
But the key point of my question, and I understand the repurposing and using existing infrastructure where possible, but at this moment in time, does the regulatory regime as is allow for that transportation? Does it allow for the mix that you have talked about? Or do we need to get on with the job, like other countries have done, and change the regulation to allow for these things?
So the regulation of what happens in gas pipelines is a reserved matter.
Indeed.
And the UK government, I think, has indicated that it would come forward with a decision about blending of hydrogen into pipelines. Again, I'd need to go back and maybe confirm. It's either late this year or next year, I think, is the timescales they have indicated, about making a minded-to position. So we do not yet have clarity about the future use of blended hydrogen in the gas network. With the repurposing of pipelines, where the pipelines are currently in sort of natural gas duty, as in their critical infrastructure, again, I believe all of those decisions are reserved, and that would have to go through due process.
Anyone else got anything else to add in that? I've just got one tiny little question left. Obviously, you've said that there is that move, but we've been waiting for a long while for those changes in regulations. My understanding is that the Leeds 2020 project was supposed to help us reach decisions in terms of some of the regulatory change for storage and transportation. Why has it taken the UK so long to do all of this?
Very good question. The only project I can think of which appears to be making some headway on this is Project Oldborough Pathfinder, which is being led by SSE. It's about the production of green hydrogen, the storage of green hydrogen in salt caverns, and the use of that hydrogen in large-scale gas turbines. I think to start with, using blended hydrogen into hundreds of megawatt-scale gas turbines. Very much driven by the desire to develop responsive power at large scale. So that is clearly sort of a step in the right direction. But there's various pieces of work that have been started. National Gas are doing a project called Project Union, and that is looking at repurposing some of the UK's gas network on a phased basis from gas duty to hydrogen. And SGN are looking at a H2 Caledonia, and likewise seeing how you can actually repurpose existing infrastructure to hydrogen. SGN have gone one stage further, and they are actually about to start a trial between Grangemouth and Granton, which is the Ofgem supported LTS Futures, which is about recommissioning an existing pipeline, about 25 miles, as a test of can this actually be done in practice, take an existing gas pipeline and repurpose that to hydrogen. So there is some encouraging steps in that respect, but the regulation piece is not so clear.
Too long, basically. Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Sarah, the next question is yours.
Thank you, Convener. I'm keen to dig down a bit more about the Grangemouth opportunities, particularly in terms of the green hydrogen options, because as we know, the closer you get to new technology, the more you can bring the price down if you've got the tech and you've got the skills. So I just wanted to ask about both Grangemouth and what are the other opportunities for developing green hydrogen in Scotland? Would you put Grangemouth on that list, and where else would you identify? I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah, start there. So Grangemouth is kind of the key opportunity in terms of industrial decarbonisation as a particularly difficult sticking point of the net zero transition. But the other kind of key enabler would also be the transformation of the power system. So where we get flexible new thermal power production that is able to back up the amount of renewables that we have on the system. So in that extent, we'd be looking at, in particular, the Peterhead power station, which is in proximity to Acorn, which at the moment the future for that is on a fairly blue hydrogen implied trajectory, but could pave the way towards also the use of green hydrogen in CCGTs. and there is potential for there to be more power stations in Scotland as there used to be. We have a lot of power station sites with transmission capacity that's no longer being used. So we could look, for example, at reintroducing more thermal power production capacity in Scotland that's making use of green hydrogen where it's being produced in, next to offshore wind farms, for example. So I would see that as a key focus for where we want to be enabling that market.
Right, thank you. And Professor Anderson, do you want to come in on that?
Add, but obviously Grangemouth has a very good infrastructure. It has a skill space as well. It's quite in between Edinburgh and Glasgow. So if you do have any excess heat, you could use that heat for district heating, for example, which has been used by other countries. And also if you have hardening there, you could use that to more value-added chemicals, such as jet fuel in the future. So I think Grangemouth is very well placed to play in the green hardening state.
And is there something we need to do to get more joined-up thinking between NESO and the grid and, you know, the next round of hydrogen allocations? Is there a way to actually make sense of this in those two sites?
I would say that the strategic spatial strategic energy plan that's due for its first iteration next year is a key enabler of that. So the process that's currently being undertaken to determine the optimal location of large-scale hydrogen infrastructure alongside electricity networks. The first iteration of that is at a fairly low resolution. So, for example, the entirety of the south of Scotland and the Central Belt is one region of that model. So I think it's very key that that the Scottish bodies interact well with the NESO process for making sure that they properly represent the opportunities within that space, that they don't see, for example, specific social or natural factors being constraints on the development of hydrogen infrastructure in Scotland due to the fact they're representing it at a very low resolution. So I think the strategic spatial energy plan is a key enabler to this.
And is that kind of linked to the offshore wind production of electricity as well? Because a couple of you have mentioned constraint payments. Is that relative to both the different sites you're talking about?
Yes. So the strategic plan for spatial energy will include both network and the opportunity for production. So the fact that you have the ability to produce much higher capacity factor wind energy within Scotland, but at the same time you're facing more significant network constraints and the difficulty of moving that to centres of demand. So hopefully that that measure will will produce the outcome that it recognises that the benefits of having renewable energy located in Scottish waters outweighs the network constraint costs. I would also observe that it's important to note that it can be seen that transportation of gas on a national scale can be a cheaper form of moving energy around than electricity. So if you take it on a per unit energy distance moved basis, historically it's been the case that gas is cheaper to move than electricity, and that remains the case for hydrogen as well. So in that basis, if we are seeing a strategic spatial plan that recognises having large amounts of renewable energy production in Scotland remote from British demand is a desirable outcome, that hydrogen as a transportation method is a way of enabling that alongside reinforcement electricity networks.
Okay. And do you want to come in, Dr Holmes, about what are the key sites for green hydrogen in Scotland, and is Grangemouth one of them?
So, talking about Project Willow, they've identified a number of areas for Grangemouth to act as essentially a conversion hub, taking clean energy and turning that into products. And again, this is where hydrogen as a molecule can actually offer you all sorts of things that you can't do with electricity. So you can use it for treating biofuels to make them into quality suitable for aviation fuel. You can use it to help make chemical feedstocks, so your methanol, but also to make ammonia. And ammonia could be used as a fuel, but in the world today, hydrogen has two main uses. Splits roughly 50-50. About half is used for refining and fuels production, and about half is used for fertiliser production. And it's the fertiliser production which is absolutely critical to food security on a global level. So if you took fertiliser out of the market, your food yield would probably drop by about a factor of 2. Now, everywhere has crops, typically uses fertilisers. There is an opportunity, and this has been recognised, and it's starting to happen already. We have members here in Edinburgh working on a project to produce green fertiliser in Paraguay. And that is using hydropower, 100 megawatts, to produce pretty much enough fertiliser to make Paraguay self-sufficient in green fertiliser. The opportunity could be the same for Scotland. The UK no longer has any fertiliser production. They were both shut down about 2-3 years ago when the price of natural gas went up. Locations like Grangemouth, which are used to handling large quantities of industrial chemicals, they've got, mentioned already, the skilled workforce. This would appear to be a slam dunk for Scotland. If Scotland can access the low-cost energy from offshore wind, produce the hydrogen, move the hydrogen down to Grangemouth, and then make these products which can in turn not just decarbonise Grangemouth, but can decarbonise some of the strategic industries in Scotland. I'm thinking here of the whisky sector. There could be other food sectors. That has got to be something which, if we don't get that, that's a massive opportunity missed. That's all I'd like to say about that. So why Grangemouth? It's got the location, it's got the skills, it's got the infrastructure. It's been mentioned in the Project Willow report. You've got rail, you've got sea, you've got road, all of these things that make it an ideal location. It's not to say that other locations couldn't make this work, but if you've got everything at Grangemouth, then why would you look beyond it?
Okay, that's quite strong. Can I add in the issue about, you've just talked about the Project Willow report, and we've had a couple of briefings on it, and those are some of the options that are mentioned in terms of the options, in terms of use of hydrogen. The other option is potential feedstock for low-carbon shipping and aviation fuels. Yep. Just wondering if you'd like to comment on that, because, again, there's an opportunity in terms of a huge transformation of airlines that we're expecting over the next few years. And is there an opportunity for Scotland here at Grangemouth? Probably.
I just feel that and I'm not sure if the Project Willow report actually mentioned fertiliser specifically. Mm-hmm. It did, right? Okay, that's good. Because there's a difference between being able to do something and for the market to have a willingness to take it up. And I think there are some markets, we've seen this with hydrogen deployments, who are much more willing to actually take that step forward. So the food and drink sector typically has been looking very closely at its overall carbon footprint. The construction sector, thanks to public procurement support, is also starting to look very carefully at their overall carbon footprint. Why am I mentioning this? Is because it's that willingness to change. The willingness to change of the aviation sector, I think, is going to be very much tempered by the cost of SAF compared to the cost of standard jet fuel. And until governments come forward with compelling reasons why aviation will actually take a much higher proportion of SAF, then the market could be limited. With fertiliser, with other approaches, I think we're much closer to market than with SAF, and that's the reason I'm seeing that as the immediate opportunity. SAF, yes, but again, for it to work properly, we would need to have access to not just the hydrogen. You'd need to also think very carefully about the access to the biogenic CO2. The reason being is that markets, including Europe, if they're going to be taking these products, be that green methanol, be that SAF, are expecting the products to be made with low-carbon hydrogen and also with biogenic carbon feedstocks.
I don't know if you saw, Sarah, I think John wanted to come in. Nigel was very quick off the mark. So just
to say the same as with the
yes, I was going to ask you
natural gas pipeline.
Yeah.
It's obviously consultations from Whitehall. And similar with sustainable aviation fuels, there's some consultations, and they will take a decision, I believe, in a year or two time in terms of the support for that. So for me, it probably be best to wait until if that support is materialized, until putting finance behind that. Also, just to reflect what Nigel was saying, for HEFA you will need oil. You're using waste cooking oil just now, but all of Europe is going to scavenge the market for waste cooking oil to do HEFA. And alcohol to jet, you need ethanol. I do like whiskey, so the price of whiskey is probably going to go up with alcohol to jet. So there's some constraints there, not only in the Hardian field, but also in terms of the way you're getting your carbon from in that sense. So, but if you have Hardian at Grangemouth, and if you build that up like Nigel was saying, then you can use that for the different chemicals later on.
Okay, that's helpful. I mean, I'm going to go back and reread Project Willow again because it gets very techy about what the alternatives are. But sustainable aviation fuel stood out for me, but also thinking about rail and bus. I know we're using hydrogen in Aberdeen. It's like, what are your opportunities in terms of joined up thinking, in terms of electricity supply, the site, and potential networks, given you're in the central belt as well as the northeast. But I was interested, did you want to comment on that issue, Dr Hawker, about green hydrogen, how you would use it? Is SAF on the table?
It was a slightly separate point, but I wanted to just make a quick distinction between hydrogen itself and hydrogen derivatives in terms of Scotland's place in an international market. So if you're producing hydrogen and selling hydrogen to users of that gas, you have an implicit advantage as a domestic producer over international imports, because you can supply hydrogen directly, whereas any imports would have to be converted to a transportation medium such as ammonia, which implies costs, efficiency losses. So there is an implicit advantage to domestic hydrogen production over imports. That's not the case for hydrogen derivatives such as aviation fuels, marine fuels, because they are already going to be in a form which is far more easily transportable. So in that case, we need to consider carefully whether the products that are being produced at Grangemouth will be competitive with imports landing at shore at a potentially very cost-competitive price, given that there are other countries where these perhaps could be produced more cheaply than they are in Scotland. So essentially, Grangemouth would face the same challenges as it has in the past over whether it's fully competitive for, in the context of an import market.
Okay, thank you. I'll pause for reflection and let the next colleague come in.
Douglas, I think you're coming up in
pick up on that point. Then. So why would Grangemouth not be price competitive? What's the reasons behind that?
I'm not saying it wouldn't necessarily be price competitive, but if you're looking at the production of hydrogen on an international basis, then there are other countries and means of producing, for example, green hydrogen that can come in at a much lower cost. So, for example, if you look at ammonia production, that could be potentially done very low cost in the Middle East through the use of solar power that would still meet low carbon standards. And I think there has been analysis shown that if you're looking at the actual hydrogen as an end product, that wouldn't be cost competitive. But if you're looking at ammonia as an end-use product, then potentially we would be undercut by those international markets. And I think there was also concern over the previous American administration using, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act to basically undercut prices on those same low-carbon products. So we can't take it for guaranteed that Grangemouth would be the lowest cost.
Okay, and I'm looking at the Project Willow, and it's got e-methanol and methanol to jet, and it's looking at the capex cost of 1.7 to 2.1 billion. And for the e-ammonia plant, it would be a capex cost of 2 to 2.5 billion. So I guess that would have to be factored into that price, and because we don't want to be building something here that is not going to be price competitive going forward, I guess.
Yes, or additionally, if there is national scale legislation that helps deal with that, and tariffs or whatever, then that could help that situation. But yes, it shouldn't be automatically assumed that these derivatives produced at Grangemouth would be cheaper than imports at the point of landfall.
Okay, Nigel.
So I think you have another session planned for next week where you're taking evidence from industry. That would be a very good question to put to the industry members who will be attending. What I've heard from one of my members who is actually developing projects in America at gigawatt scale is that Scotland actually matches very closely the price of green hydrogen production compared to America. So, there may be places with lower cost renewable electricity, but one of the challenges with solar is actually mapping that solar availability. And okay, it's regular, sort of day by day, but if the electrolyzers are running straight off the solar, then you only run them half the time. And that can be done, but most of the evidence so far is that the steady state production of hydrogen on electrolyzers, which goes back 100 years, is by far the best approach in terms of producing the hydrogen at low cost.
How big a difference would zonal pricing make towards the cost of hydrogen production in Scotland?
So, again, 75 or 80% of the cost of green hydrogen is probably associated with the electricity, where the electricity price is high. As the price comes down, the capex and opex costs become, and maintenance costs become more significant. The challenge with zonal pricing is unintended consequences. So if you really reduce the price in a particular zone, you may get access to some of the electricity that's already there at lower cost, but will that discourage further investment by the renewables developers in that particular location? And if we're looking to scale up, we need to find a way to make sure that what we do is sustainable in more ways than one. As in, we are not discouraging the right level of investment in generation that we need to actually support the growth. The scale of the projects we're looking at, I should have actually done the back of the envelope sum for Willow, but you're looking at multi-gigawatt scale of hydrogen demand for delivering all of what you're proposing for Project Willow. And that will need multi-gigawatts of additional power generation to be in place. And we want to make sure that power generation is encouraged to be located in Scotland.
And also for the price to come down, obviously.
Absolutely, yes. Yes. So we want that additional generation, but we also want to achieve the optimum price for production of the green hydrogen. Totally.
Okay. Just want to go back to a question raised about repurposing gas lines. How easy is it to actually repurpose gas pipelines, and do we have the capacity at present to, is there a spare connection between Kintore and Grangemouth, for example? So this question of how easy it might be to repurpose is, to a large extent, that is being looked at by the LTS Futures project, which is recommissioning the pipeline between Grangemouth and Granton. There's also a lot of work going on within the UK with the company previous National Grid, now National Gas, looking at, I think it's the High Futures project, taking components such as bits of pipe, valves, compressors, and actually ones that have been used in natural gas duty, running them in hydrogen duty under test conditions to show, and so far the results have all been good, that essentially most of the components that you've got in the existing pipeline networks can be reused with hydrogen. There is also evidence from other countries like Germany, who are going through a similar process. Germany has got a very clear strategy for developing a core network of, I think it's just under 10,000 kilometres of hydrogen pipelines basically as an industrial supply network for hydrogen to be in place, I think, by 2030. And they are using a mixture of existing pipeline and new pipeline to achieve that. So the evidence from all of the testing, the evidence from what's happening elsewhere, is that existing pipelines can be converted from natural gas duty to hydrogen duty. And is that just as is, doesn't need pipe in pipe or anything like that? Or
My understanding is it's not pipe in pipe. Yeah, you've got to clearly be sure that the quality of the material used, the condition of the material used is appropriate. There may be slight changes to the operating conditions, but my understanding is, yes, substantially, these pipelines can be recommissioned into hydrogen duty. And it may well be that it's not just gas pipelines that can be recommissioned. There could be other pipelines which would be very relevant for Grangemouth, which could also be brought into hydrogen duty.
Can I just ask a question on this specific point? My understanding is that you can move a huge amount more hydrogen in a smaller pipe than you can move natural gas. Is that not right?
So it's almost the same. So natural gas, has about, by volume, has about 3 times the energy density as hydrogen gas. But hydrogen gas is very slippery, so it moves through the pipes easier. And the end effect, and it's called the Wobbe index, it's basically the energy deliverability down a pipe, is not that different between hydrogen and natural gas. So again, the work that was done back in 2016 with the Leeds Citygate, looking at all of the pipe work around Leeds, and could you convert that from being natural gas duty to hydrogen duty, I think they identified that all of it, with the exception of about 500 metres, the size that you use for natural gas was the size that you could use for the hydrogen duty.
So it will move this. Sorry, just so I've got this clear in my brain, because we've got these big pipelines. I can't remember the size of it. The one that goes through my farm at home, which is sort of 4 foot. It's a big one from Aberdeen to Inverness. If that was made into hydrogen, it would transmit the same amount of hydrogen as it would the natural gas.
So the same amount of energy could flow down that pipe as hydrogen, as natural gas. So if it's a 48-inch pipeline, that's actually the size of pipeline that...
I understand the same amount of energy, but if it... sorry, I'm a simple soul. I'm trying to understand. You said hydrogen's more slippery. So if it's more slippery, that suggests to me it moves at a more quicker pace than things. So actually, over a period of an hour, you would probably be delivering more slippery gas than non-slippery gas for a layman.
By volume, yes. By volume, there would be 3 times more hydrogen going down the pipe than natural gas, correct?
Thank you for clarifying that. Douglas, back to you.
no, that's everything just now, Camilla.
Okay, thank you. Mark, I think you've got some questions you want to ask.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the issue of what sectors you think will be using hydrogen in the future. So I noticed that the Climate Change Committee doesn't believe that hydrogen will have a significant role to play in relation to surface transport, sceptical about its role in terms of domestic heating. You spoke earlier on about thermal generation potentially using green hydrogen in the future, but as we understand it, there's no plans that SSE would have to take Peterhead 2 and use hydrogen there. So I guess we're quite early stages here, but I'm interested in your thoughts on what are the sectors where you do think there's an application for hydrogen, and also kind of whether you kind of recognise that sort of hydrogen hierarchy, that hydrogen ladder of use. Is that something that is kind of accepted, that broadly reflects where the investment potential is and where perhaps we can get the greatest decarbonisation for the use of blue, green or possibly green hydrogen more in the future? So,
yep, I can
Graham, do you want to start with that? And then we'll,
I think a lot of this comes back to the efficiency question that was raised earlier. That the fundamental issue, if you talk about green hydrogen anyway, that you lose a lot of the energy that you're putting in electricity in order to derive hydrogen, and potentially lose even more if you're going full cycle and converting that back into electricity. But efficiency is a very blunt metric that shouldn't be used as a kind of blanket reason not to do this, because it depends on the counterfactual. So this is where, for example, assessments like hydrogen hierarchies come in. So what is the counterfactual? How efficient is the process you might otherwise use? So, for example, when we're discussing the decarbonisation of heating, the CCC has broadly come to its position on not recommending hydrogen for domestic heating, because the counterfactual is direct use of electricity, that it is seen as feasible, that we can install heat pumps and use the electricity directly. So wherever possible, use electricity directly to avoid those efficiency losses. But there are other components of the system where those losses are not so easily avoided. And that's where hydrogen becomes more and more competitive. Or there are cases like industrial decarbonisation where implicitly you can't always electrify. There are processes that fundamentally require hydrogen. So that gives you your potential ordering. And I think that's a useful way of viewing it. However, there are many hydrogen hierarchies. The Scottish Government has produced its own, and there are many more available that don't all agree on the specific ordering of the competitiveness of hydrogen. And there's also a fair number of assumptions of the counterfactual technologies that go into those. So I would see, for example, I would agree with the CCC's position on residential heating, that heat pumps should be the way forward as long as we can deploy them effectively, because we avoid all those losses. But if we are looking at other sectors where the translation to electrification is not so clear-cut, not so easy to achieve, then that's where hydrogen comes in quite clearly. Transport's a difficult one. I think that's where the edge case kind of appears. But there are other, I would say, very clear-cut cases. So, for example, the seasonal storage problem is one that really hydrogen is the only thing we have available to address. So using cavern storage to replace the large-scale storage of natural gas that we currently rely on, there isn't really any other solution to that problem.
Okay. Nigel, you mentioned, fertiliser sector earlier on. We don't have a fertiliser sector, but a sector that could be brought back effectively and decarbonised that way. What do you see in relation to the hierarchy as being the areas that most focus needs to go into?
So the hierarchy is a very sort of attractive approach. You end up with the ladder, and you've got the A stuff at the top and the Zs at the bottom. I do recall that Michael Liebrich, one of his versions of the ladder, had, why would you use electricity to make green hydrogen and then turn that back into electricity? Completely bonkers. You lose 70% of the energy when you produce the hydrogen, and then when you turn it back into electricity, you're probably going to lose 50% of that. But we're now in a place where, as Graham says, we're looking at using the hydrogen storage, because that is basically the only game in town for long-duration energy storage for clean power generation. So as Graham said, the efficiency is quite a blunt metric. There are other things we need to consider here, and one of the approaches I often go back to is a very simple model. It's called the energy trilemma. It's a triangle. There's 3 points to it. One's cost, the other is security of supply, and the third is environmental impact. And very difficult to actually find approaches that satisfy all three. It's nearly always a compromise between them. So I would hope that in coming to their decisions, the CCC are actually thinking carefully about, I'm sure they are, looking at the energy trilemma. But when it comes to this question of sort of electrification for heat, if we're in the situation on cold days where you're actually producing hydrogen, moving it into storage, then converting that back into electricity in order to keep people warm, that overall efficiency chain doesn't look very pretty. All I'm saying is sometimes it may be quicker to actually and simpler to take the direct approach.
But I'm just thinking, just before I go to John, you're talking about that storage scenario in the summer where there's less use of heat pumps. There's a better sort of ability to kind of store that. But isn't the issue here that we need a kind of basket of different technologies in terms of electrification? So the storage issue becomes less of an issue if you're actually looking at how you deploy that resilience throughout the entire year. Different balancing. So I'm just thinking of a situation where you have an air source heat pump installed in your house, but why would you also have another system that uses a different type of technology, a different hydrogen, for example? So I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. My job is to promote the hydrogen sector, but I fully recognise that the hydrogen sector is part of the energy system. And as I mentioned in one of my answers earlier, if we do things which actually discourage investment in renewables, we will then compromise the delivery of hydrogen. We also need to recognise that the use of hydrogen will be, to a large extent, defined by industry uptake, consumer uptake. So are we able to provide people with what they want, which is the convenience of the fuel, where they want it and when they want it? And that is the challenge for all of the energy system. If we're going to make things happen, we've got to think about the cost, the security of supply, and the environmental impacts.
Yeah. John, I'm interested in your views and also, what the international comparisons are. So are there different approaches in relation to, which sectors are being targeted in Europe or across the world? Are there some stark differences across the world in terms of that hydrogen investment?
So just to address the efficiency issue with hydrogen production, so when you turn electricity into hydrogen, most of the efficient loss is heat. If you go to industrial clusters like Grangemouth, about 70% of the CO2 there is because of heat and steam generation. So it's a big opportunity to harvest that heat generated during hydrogen production and use that at the industrial site. So you could probably reduce a lot in terms of the conversion efficiency there. And when you're using hydrogen, if you go to Europe, for example, they use a lot of CHP. So if you go to Denmark, about 60% of their energy is CHP, where they use the hydrogen to burn into a turbine. They get 30% electricity, and they get 60% heat that they use, and they only have a conversion loss of 10%. Putting Grangemouth in action, you can harvest that at the industrial site, or you can have that as a district heating for Falkirk, for example. And if you can showcase that works well in Grangemouth, when you have harvesting of the efficiency losses during production of hydrogen, you store the hydrogen into the winter, and then using the CHP and harvest the efficiency in terms of heat going out during CHP in winter, you will probably have a very good business case. But as Nigel said, you probably want to ask the industrial panel about the economics of it. Yeah.
So that would be very much a bespoke kind of project, an application of hydrogen heating within a particular geographic area rather than more of a national approach to adoption of heating in individual homes.
Yeah, and I'll probably bring in curtailed energy, what you call constraint payments as well. So obviously in 2021, there was about 230 million in Scotland, I believe. Last year was 390, so nearly a doubling within 3 years. So if you take more and more wind into it, you probably go to a similar situation they have in Netherlands, for example, where you go to negative cost of electricity during the day, and then it goes up to like 200 euros per megawatt hour during the night because there's no sun. So if you have Grangemouth harvesting that excess electricity and put it into hydrogen and store it, you should be able to balance that price and get the price of hydrogen down significantly as well, and not having to pay so much constraint.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Just before we go to the Deputy Convener's questions, I think, Douglas, you've got a specific question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask John about, you mentioned hydrogen storage. In practical terms, how is it stored? And I guess the communities wouldn't be too happy with a huge storage facility next to their homes.
I was actually going to be in Austria. I used to go a little bit. They have something called Sunstore in Austria, where they have a very porous rock, which is quite well defined. It's like a big tank. They have solar during the day. They use that solar to produce hydrogen, and then they put the hydrogen in underground. And then they take the hydrogen out during winter and run it through a combined heat and power. And they have shown that overall thing. So in Scotland, we don't have salt, unfortunately, which is the best way to store, because Britain has stored in salt since 1972. But if you have confined rock that is porous, with like a cap rock on top and a cap rock on the bottom, you can store hydrogen very, very safely there at low cost. So we do a lot of research on that.
But do we know if we've got that facilities in Scotland, or is that something that would still have to be?
You have a lot of storage opportunities in Scotland, even on a Grangemouth. That's not the problem.
So it would be stored basically back in rocks?
Yeah, you will have an initial loss, which you call a cushion gas, and then you will fill up the volume with hydrogen, and then you have a working volume where you take hydrogen in and out as you need it. So we're working on how to constrain that cushion gas, because that will be within what the capital expenditure you call it, because that hydrogen most likely will stay there until the end of the project where you can take it out. So it's about having a good working volume that you take in and out quite quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nigel, do you want to come in on that storage question?
Yes, there are various ways of storing hydrogen. A lot of them involve steel tanks, putting the gas into steel tanks at pressures from 30 atmospheres up to 100. The project over in Fife, the H100 project, is using above-ground steel tanks. A company here in Edinburgh, Gravitricity, are developing steel tanks that can be buried in the ground, that can allow you 10 times more storage at higher pressure. But it's also worth reflecting on where we've come from, and think of Towns Gas and all the gas holders that used to be dotted around the country. Very simple, almost at no pressure at all. You can actually store gas, so that's a tried and tested approach for local storage. And indeed, on farms, there's probably approaches to use with biogas, biogas tanks, gas bags, which potentially could be used for hydrogen. I'm not aware of them being tried, but it's a gas. You need to be respectful in terms of it's quite slippery and it's flammable. But some of these are tried and tested.
Is it pressure is the same, or is it greater pressure for hydrogen?
Generally, you would run hydrogen storage at very similar pressures to, if you're using it in the gas networks, very similar pressures to the pressures they use today. As I mentioned earlier, because it's slippery, it moves through the pipes at pretty much the same pressures, both in storage, distribution, and household applications. For the old gas holders, they were only storing it at maybe a few pounds pressure, very, very low pressure.
And hydrogen would be the same?
Hydrogen would be the same. A Towns Gas was 50% hydrogen.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Camino.
I'm sure somebody will delve into that, and whether the explosive content in those tanks are the same as gas, because that's what that would cause some people concern. Is it? If it goes wrong, does it go wrong big time compared to gas?
There's been a whole load of work carried out, funded by the UK government, Hydrogen for Heat, which looked at these questions of hydrogen use in domestic applications, and they came back with there is no key conclusion: there's no additional risk from use of hydrogen.
Okay, good. Thank you for clarifying that, Michael. You've got some questions.
Yeah, good morning. I want to turn to the issue of the export potential of green hydrogen from Scotland. It's obviously been an area of priority for the Scottish Government and also for some of the enterprise agencies and some of the commercial interested parties. I wonder if you can give us your sense of what you think the export potential might be of green hydrogen in particular from Scotland, and whether the off-taker market in other European countries is developing at a faster rate than it potentially is here in Scotland.
I'm happy to start. So the Scottish Government, they put out their hydrogen policy statement in December 2020, and the opportunity for export of hydrogen from Scotland was one of the key features of this policy statement. It recognised that the amount of renewables could be built up in Scotland. I think it was mentioned earlier, the target for 25 gigawatts of low-carbon hydrogen production by 2045, which in numbers translates into 126 terawatt hours, which is pretty much as the same as the total Scottish energy demand was expected to be by 2045. And I can't remember the exact number, but it was just under 100 terawatt hours, which was suggested could be exported from Scotland into adjacent markets. So that could be the rest of the UK. But Germany, in particular, was identified as a potential market, given the scale of industry in Germany and their desire to decarbonise. So that's led to various studies, including the hydrogen backbone link. That was a work supported by the Scottish Government, which looked at a pipeline between Scotland and Germany. In fact, it wasn't just one point in Scotland. It was looking at some of the ways where different locations around Scotland could connect into this pipeline, centred on St Fergus, and going across, I think it was due to land in Emden on the north coast of Germany. That was a 10-gigawatt pipeline. I think that was £3.5 billion investment. And the estimated cost for delivering a kilo of hydrogen into Germany was something like 30 pence or 30 euro cents. What that means is that Scotland, if it has a competitive price of producing hydrogen in Scotland, would have a competitive price of delivering gaseous hydrogen into Germany. It's already been mentioned that if you start to make derivatives, these are the ammonias and the methanols, they can be shipped around the world at low cost. So the really interesting part here, and this has been picked up in Germany, is that Scotland could deliver that hydrogen gas into Germany at a competitive price. You could try importing ammonia and cracking it back into hydrogen, but that would probably be as expensive or more expensive than that delivered hydrogen from Scotland. So that's been identified as a key opportunity. You ask, is the off-taker market developing faster in Europe? And the answer is, in many cases, yes. I think Germany is a very good case in point. I mentioned earlier the German work on a core hydrogen network, 9,600 kilometres of pipeline around Germany dedicated to hydrogen, basically connecting all areas of production, import with off-takers. Not only are they looking to get the infrastructure in place, they're also looking at the commercial structures which would actually encourage that. So they have an initiative called H2 Global, and that's almost like contracts for differences, but it's looking at the who is wanting to provide hydrogen, who is wanting to offtake hydrogen, what is the price of the providers, what is the price of the off-takers, and starting to match the lowest price of supply with the people who are willing to offtake it, and if there's a difference, they're covering some of that difference in the cost between the off-takers and the producer. So that is really helping to stimulate the market. They're also looking, as part of H2 Global, they've gone out for various tenders for suppliers from outside Germany to bid into the German supply market. So developing both in terms of the infrastructure, but also the commercial and regulatory structures that would help that to happen. And it's worth looking at very, very closely because that is a model that seems to be moving forward, driven to a large extent by Germany's focus on industrial strategy and decarbonising of industry, which includes steel, car manufacture, and all sorts of other heavy industry.
John.
Just to mention that in Europe, there's about close to 2,000 kilometers of dedicated hydrogen pipeline. So they have an infrastructure for how to spread that throughout Europe. They're putting billions of euros into hydrogen valleys, where they're proving that concept of production, transport, and end use, so produce it, transport and use it. So they are investing heavily into the hydrogen infrastructure chain. They also have quite a significant amount of hydrogen fueling stations for cars and trucks. So they're putting everything in place now. What they do need is low-cost hydrogen produced at scale. And there's, I believe Scotland can come in. You have water, because it rains quite a lot and you have a lot of sea. And you have wind, probably the biggest wind potential in Europe. If you can merge those two together and start with Grangemouth to how to show how it can be done, then I think you have something that can have a bright future.
Okay. Sorry.
Can I jump in on the same question? The kind of competitive basis for Scotland to export green hydrogen in particular is based on the availability of low-cost renewable energy. As mentioned before, the fact that our wind farms have higher capacity factors and hence the low-carbon electricity can potentially be lower cost than it would be elsewhere, implying a lower cost of green hydrogen production for us than continental competition. But at the moment, hydrogen producers are not fully exposed to that low price. The market as it currently exists means that electrolyzers that we were producing at scale connected to the electricity grid would be paying grid average costs. The low carbon hydrogen standard only recognises a GB-wide carbon intensity of electricity. So this means all the potential benefits that Scotland does have to be competitive in green hydrogen production aren't currently being made use of because the markets are not designed to enable it. There was a question before about the potential for zonal pricing to improve this. That would be one solution. I wouldn't say that it's the only solution, but it does need to be recognised that at the moment, green hydrogen production wouldn't be competitive because it cannot directly access that low-cost renewable production or opportunity that we do have.
Okay, thanks. Can I turn to the issue then of transportation? Obviously, pipeline is what appears to be the optimal model for transportation if it was for export purposes, but there's also the potential for it to be exported by ship as well. What's your view on the potential modes of transportation from Scotland to other parts of Europe or beyond? Is shipping just cost prohibitive, and technologically is it mature enough to give people the confidence that they might need to make the investment in the shipping of hydrogen?
I'm happy to start with that one. So, yeah, your question is about shipping. Can I just come back to the pipeline question very, very briefly? So, the work on the hydrogen backbone link, the UK government recently published a report on the opportunity for hydrogen exports between the UK and Europe. And that actually picked up on some of the work that's been done recently to look at, there are pipelines being built out into the North Sea. So again, this is something that's worth reflecting on from the North German sector and indeed the Dutch sector as well. There is a project called Aquaductus, which is building that pipeline out. And so they're doing this to try and reduce the cost of bringing energy from offshore wind farms into North Germany. And it's going not quite up to Teesside, but it's not far off. It's heading up towards Dogger Bank, 20 gigawatts of hydrogen pipeline capacity. And the suggestion is that, UK, Scotland should look at actually joining up with this Aquaductus pipeline. And that essentially would help to cut the cost of a pipeline connection between Scotland and Europe in half. So the pipeline, although it's expensive, it could actually be less expensive than we initially thought. And there is some further work, I believe, being undertaken by the Net Zero Technology Centre on this one. But coming back to your question about shipping, the challenge is with hydrogen, as always, it's a very light gas. So if you're going to transport it as a gas, it takes up a lot of space. You then have to compress it. That then means you have to move around high pressure storage. I'm not saying it can't be done. I think it has been some work to look at this, but it's not the ideal. And you certainly wouldn't be looking at moving hydrogen over long distances by this approach, but maybe on a North Sea basis, it could work. There's also been considerable work looking at moving liquid hydrogen. So that's an established way of storing and transporting hydrogen. The challenge there being it is super cold. So it's just I think it's about 20 degrees above absolute zero. And there are other carriers being considered. So where you absorb the hydrogen into an organic molecule and reversibly, so you absorb and desorb it. That has its attractions because the material would be a bit like handling petrol or diesel. But all of these have complexity, which brings in additional costs. So, at the moment, the jury is still out as to which one you might do. The other way you might move it around would be as ammonia. So we've already spoken about ammonia production in Grangemouth. That is, again, much more storable and transportable than hydrogen. And a lot of it depends on what the customer want. If they want hydrogen gas, then a pipeline is the best option. If they're looking for ammonia or methanol, then that would be the way to transport it.
And what role do you think Grangemouth could play in this?
The facilities at Grangemouth, make it again a very, very obvious choice. They don't currently handle ammonia, but things like ethanol products, petroleum products, all of this, the liquids, LPGs are all handled at Grangemouth. They've got the facilities at the port for loading ships. They've got the staff. They've got the experience with handling these at volume. So again, it would appear to be the obvious choice. Probably one of the best locations, if not the best location in Scotland for that type of activity.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'm just, Mark, very briefly at the end.
Yeah, thanks.
And Sarah. Yeah,
Obviously,
I've got you both done.
The focus is on Project Willow and Grangemouth, but I was also interested in Mossmoran, and I think you talked about the ethylene cracker early on, and just where you see hydrogen as part of that mix, if it's blue hydrogen or green hydrogen as fuel, or effectively bioethanol as feedstock. Where do you see Mossmoran kind of sitting within that industrial complex?
So Mossmoran is actually already connected to Grangemouth, by pipeline. There's a ethylene product line that runs between the two. But they're actually feeding different markets. So my belief at the moment is that most of Mossmoran's ethylene product is exported by ship from Brayfoot Bay. Their feedstock is imported. I think some of it comes down pipes, some of it may be coming by ship. So the ethane, both Grangemouth and Mossmoran, import the ethane. With Mossmoran, it had a disadvantage compared to Grangemouth in that it was just a cracker, so they didn't have the other plants around it. So essentially all of the product from Mossmoran was exported. With Grangemouth, they still have significant amounts of petrochemical plastics production on the site. So Mossmoran, the opportunity is to, yes, it could decarbonise it. The way to do that would be very much like Grangemouth, bring the hydrogen in by pipeline. There are good grid connections next to Mossmoran. It's actually probably better off than Grangemouth in that respect. So Mossmoran may have more opportunity to actually produce green hydrogen on site than Grangemouth. With Grangemouth, my understanding was that the project that RWE are developing, the HAR2 project, Green Hydrogen Grangemouth, originally was going to be, I think, 200 megawatts scale, is now 100. And I think part of that was just capacity constraints on the grid. But with Grangemouth, what we haven't mentioned is that just over the river from Grangemouth is Longannet. Graham, you mentioned legacy power station sites. Longannet has got a super grid connection. So, with scaling up Grangemouth, as well as pipelines, the potential could be for Longannet to be one of the hubs of green hydrogen production in Scotland at very large scale.
Thanks.
Sarah, the final question to one panel member. Nigel's had quite a run, so go for who you like.
Yeah, it was going back to the joined-up thinking here in terms of what the economic opportunities are for investment at Grangemouth. You were just talking about transporting hydrogen on ships. You could also power ships with hydrogen. It's how do we get the use of hydrogen in a way that's going to be cost-effective and benefiting the Scottish economy, and what are the opportunities to actually deliver that in a joined-up way at Grangemouth? Just as a last thought. Who wants to come first? Professor Anderson?
Grangemouth is quite well located between Edinburgh and Glasgow. There's a lot of transport there. So it's an ideal hub. In fact, I was talking with Edinburgh Airport. They want to decarbonise, and they installed about 17,000 solar panels last year, I believe. And the environmental manager there wants that to be transferred into hydrogen, so they can decarbonise the airport even more. but more so that trucks coming from Glasgow and Edinburgh can come in and fuel there in Hardin. So they have a small capacity of Edinburgh Airport, but for Grangemouth, that capacity would be tremendous big. So there would be no capacity issues there. So it would be a very, very good seed to grow that Hardin economy.
Graham nodded, so I'm going to give you the final word, Graham.
Absolutely. I think the key thing to unlocking any kind of hydrogen economy in Scotland is that we need off-takers. We need somebody to actually be buying using the hydrogen to get any of this moving. And that has been the main stumbling block for many companies that are ready to make investments in hydrogen production but don't have anybody to reliably sell to at the end of the day. So Grangemouth unlocks a lot of that potential. I would also just add, representing here a university, that there is the big question of skills and the loss of skills that will be coming from the reduction of fossil fuel usage. And I think there is this huge opportunity that is mentioned in the Project Willow alongside the just transition element, that this can stimulate a large amount of new investment in education, training, employment in the Central Belt areas. And there are a lot of further education, higher education institutions in that region who I think are looking for new sources of income, shall we say, given the trends in the sector, and that this could create a lot of new opportunities across higher education and further education as well.
Thanks. I suppose we just need a plan to deliver it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thank you, panel, for giving evidence this morning. As you say, our questions will continue to another panel and into next week, and I'm briefly going to suspend the meeting to allow a changeover of witnesses. welcome back. We'll now hear from our second panel on the hydrogen aspects of Project Willow study. And I welcome to the meeting Dr. Simon Gill, an independent energy consultant who authored Green Hydrogen in Scotland, a report for the Scottish Futures Trust. And appearing remotely, Dr. Jan Rosenow, the Energy Programme Lead and Jackson Senior Research Fellow for Oriel College, University of Oxford, and Mark Symes, a Professor of Electrochemistry and Electrochemical Technology, School of Chemistry, University of Glasgow. Welcome to you all. Bizarrely enough, Simon, it appears that you are flanked on either side the way the screen is below you. There's one below you, so I can see. No, I can see you. I can see your just in front, as you can see them in front of me. So my first question, and as I said to the last panel, this is the easy one if you are listening in, is that Project Willow didn't advocate either the use of green or blue hydrogen, but that only a reliable source of low carbon hydrogen will be required. Which source do you think is the most likely one to offer a reliable and affordable supply for hydrogen in Scotland? Now, why don't I start with you, Mark, and then I'll come to you, Simon, and then to you, Jan. So, Mark.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So my background is in chemistry, specifically electrochemistry. So I've spent about the last 15 years trying to come up with new ways and more effective ways of making green hydrogen from water. So my response is always going to be that I think green hydrogen is the scalable option and is the true net zero option. And therefore, at least in the long term, it will be green hydrogen that we're relying on. There might well be a role for blue hydrogen as we transition to green hydrogen, but ultimately I would say it's green hydrogen that we wish to focus on. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Simon, blue or green?
Thanks very much, and thank you for the opportunity. So my background is as a kind of whole system energy expert. My training is in electrical engineering on the electricity side, but over the past 3 years, I have focused on every single bit of the energy system, really. So my answer would be that we need both at different stages of the transition. And a really important part of the question is the pathway from today to a net zero world in 2050, and the roles that each of those will play at different stages. So blue hydrogen provides an opportunity to provide a resilient, secure, reliable supply of hydrogen using a controllable process, kind of akin to dispatchable power stations, I suppose, on the electricity side. And that is something that you are already seeing being developed as part of the industrial clusters in England. Green hydrogen, as Mark said, provides a truly zero carbon solution, but it's dependent on variable renewable resources, and as on the electricity system, we therefore need to design a broader hydrogen system to make sure that we can get the same kind of characteristics out of that, which will include sort of really grow the importance of hydrogen network and hydrogen storage at scale. At the end of that process, my sense is that we want to be focusing primarily on ending up with a largely green hydrogen solution because of its lower carbon and because of its lack of reliance on natural gas, which if we were to continue using blue hydrogen in the long term would keep us locked into that international market for natural gas. But I don't think we should write off blue hydrogen, and I do think we should try and build it into our strategy over the next 15 years or so.
Okay, and Jan.
Thank you. Jan Rosenow, my background is in geosciences, energy efficiency and energy policy more broadly. I would very much agree with, I think, Mark's remarks that green hydrogen is preferable to using blue for the reasons that he set out. The carbon emissions of green hydrogen, if produced truly with zero carbon electricity, are zero. And of course, the carbon emissions from blue hydrogen, even if high capture rates are achieved, can never be truly zero because there's always going to be some carbon that is not captured. There's another issue that the previous witness brought up, which is the import dependency that's associated with blue. You need about 40%, give or take, additional natural gas to make the same amount of blue hydrogen in terms of the energy content. So that means we need more reliance on imported natural gas if we move from natural gas to blue hydrogen in the UK. And that, of course, has significant implications, as we have seen during the energy crisis when gas prices went through the roof and affected end users quite dramatically. So therefore, I think the more reliable source of hydrogen, where costs are more controllable, is green hydrogen.
Okay, so I'm understanding from that I think, with the exception, I'm going to put words into his mouth, Mark, who wants to go green hydrogen straight away because he thinks it's going to be a better thing. But I think that realistically, you're all saying there's a bit of blue to start with and then moving towards green by the time we get to 2045, which is, I think, our target. So my question is, how long are we looking to having to have the mix before we go totally to green hydrogen? Are we talking, I'm just not precise, are we talking 5 years, 10 years, what sort of time frame? Mark, I'll just do it the same order. Mark Simon, followed by Anne.
Yes, thank you. I think we're some way away from being able to have a system that operates entirely on green hydrogen. There are significant issues with scaling up not just the devices we would require for the hydrogen production, but also numbering up, so getting the number of devices that we would need to generate the amount of green hydrogen that we're talking about here in terms of being able to power something the size of Grangemouth or to be able to power the industrial processes that will come out of that. So I would say somewhere between 10 and 20 years at a sort of a conservative ballpark figure.
Thanks very much. Simon.
Similar, I think we're looking at towards the 2050 net zero UK deadline or 2045 Scottish deadline. I think in addition to the points that Mark's made, you've got to think about the investability and value for money of the infrastructure for blue hydrogen. If you're building it now, you don't want to spend all that money for something that's going to last you a couple of years. So if we are going to use it, we need to think about this as a part of a long-term strategy. I also don't necessarily think that we'll end up with a final energy system that is entirely green hydrogen. I think there will be a mix of the two, and that there should be. That gives you diversity of technologies. It gives you different characteristics, and it allows you to deal with the fact that we don't know what the future will look like. So I would say I would expect a 2050 system that was largely green hydrogen, but not entirely.
Okay, thank you. And Jan.
Yeah, I would agree with most of those comments that were made. I mean, we shouldn't forget that the UK uses, I think it's about 700,000 tonnes of grey hydrogen from natural gas at the moment, and that's highly carbon intensive. So the quicker we can replace that with either blue or green hydrogen, the better. And there may well be a transition period because of the difficulties of scaling up green hydrogen production and how long it takes. And we've seen, haven't we, all over Europe and beyond that, these projects don't come along as quickly as people were hoping. So it's certainly going to be required for some time to use other sources of hydrogen. And ideally, that wouldn't be grey hydrogen.
Okay, and just finally, is price going to limit this, price of hydrogen compared to price of electricity, developing it?
So, sorry.
No, you were very quick, Simon. I'm impressed that you moved quicker than those online.
Okay, well, I'll go first then. So I think we definitely need to have a real focus on driving down the cost of hydrogen. The HAR1, the hydrogen allocation round 1 for green hydrogen, cleared at £241 per megawatt hour, which is a huge, a much higher price than our electricity price. But that reflects the fact that it's an immature technology. We're dealing with very small projects, and we're dealing with quite a lot of risk for the developer who's signing up to effectively a CFD contract lasting 15 years and needing to sort of fix their costs and protect themselves over that period. So there's real opportunities, I think, over the next few allocation rounds for green hydrogen to drive that cost down. Ultimately, we will end up in a situation, I think, where hydrogen has a particular set of uses within the energy system. My view is that it won't be used much for heat or for transport, but it will be used in more specific applications where there are fewer affordable alternatives. And in that case, we will be looking at what is the cheapest and most technically feasible option. So when we have things like very high temperature industrial processes, where we have the production of derivatives for aviation or maritime fuels, for example, that's the area where we need to. We may well find that that ends up being significantly more expensive than today, but for those sectors, and we would need to think of our broader industrial strategy and transport strategies in terms of how we kind of make sure that those sectors continue to do what we want for the economy and for society overall.
Okay, I'm sort of looking now at those online. Does anyone want to come back on that before I move to Kevin for the next question?
Well, I could quickly comment on the price differential that you asked about. And it's generally assumed that blue hydrogen for some time will be cheaper than green hydrogen in the projections. Of course, there are huge uncertainties. We don't know what the price of gas is going to be in the future. It's much more reliable, I think, to forecast what the cost of renewables are going to be, because we have established learning rates. It's more difficult to determine the price of electricity in the wholesale market, because that's currently still set by gas in the UK most of the time in the year. But I think it's a fair assumption that blue hydrogen will remain cheaper for some time, but it really depends on how the gas price evolves internationally. And I would agree with Simon's remarks on end users. I'm sure we're going to get into that later on, but my own work has shown that certainly in heating in buildings, but also in industry, there is a limited role, if any, for hydrogen.
Mark, I think you wanted in as well, briefly.
Yeah, just to build on what Simon and Jan have said, for green hydrogen, there's an explicit dependence on the price of electricity, wherever that's coming from, in order to generate it, assuming that you're generating it electrolytically, which is almost certainly the case. There's also, maybe to build on Simon's comments around CapEx, an opportunity to make green hydrogen systems maybe slightly more modular, which might therefore allow developers to spread their costs in that regard.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move to the next questions, which are, well, actually, Kevin, you're next.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you, gentlemen. My first question is around about the fact that you've all highlighted that blue hydrogen is a bridging technology. Dr. Gill seems to think it will go on for longer than just being a bridging technology. In order for that to work for Scotland, how important is it that we have the Acorn carbon capture and storage project online in order to reduce the carbon emissions from that blue hydrogen? Maybe go to Mark first, please.
Thank you very much. This is a bit outside of my zone of expertise, but from what I know of blue hydrogen, we need somewhere to store the CO2 that will be generated. And therefore, I think we should have some indigenous way of storing that rather than trying to export the problem at cost.
Thank you. And Jan, please.
I would agree with that, and I think it's going to be important to make sure the capture rates that are forecasted are being achieved. So I would want that to be very closely monitored, because we have seen in other projects with carbon capture before that those rates weren't always achieved, and of course that's very important as we move towards net zero.
Thank you. Simon, please.
Yeah, sure. So I think it is an important element of that. One of the things about any hydrogen system is it is a complex system with multiple infrastructures, and we need to find a way to coordinate the investment and development of them. So for blue hydrogen, you need the production, you need the carbon capture, carbon transport, carbon storage, you need the hydrogen transport, hydrogen storage, hydrogen end use. So that's a lot of stuff that you need to invest in.
Sure.
You start to see the benefit of UK government's cluster approach in England at the moment, where they're bringing together multiple support mechanisms for each of those, or for most of those technical elements, and around, particularly on the northeast Teesside and Humber, you start to see how they come together in that whole system's sort of way, which allows each element to prosper. Now, I think we need that in Scotland. So that means there is a lot of pressure to try and get a track to cluster from UK government, to get support through the comprehensive spending review this year, and to make sure that Acorn carbon capture and storage happens, and that starts to do the same thing as we can see in the North East and North West clusters in England.
Thank you. So we need the same investment here in Scotland in Acorn as they have had in the North East of England and in Merseyside, basically.
Yes, I'd agree, yeah.
You've kind of led me on to my next set of questions, which you probably heard me ask in the first session, and that's around about hydrogen storage and transportation regulations, which we seem to be falling behind other countries here in the UK. Does the UK government need to get on with modernising those storage and transportation regulations in order for us to be competitive when it comes to hydrogen production and sale?
Yes. And there are several elements of that. There's an element about blending hydrogen into the existing natural gas mains, and there's an element of it relating to the development of a 100% hydrogen system as well. The UK government published the hydrogen roadmap, I think, in 2023, which had a lot of dates set last year for consultations and decisions on various elements of a hydrogen system, including the transport, storage and blending options. Now, I guess at least part due to the fact that we then went through a UK general election and there was a bit of a hiatus, that stalled last year. Now, I get the sense that it is starting to pick up again this year, but it really needs to be, I think, from a Scottish perspective, given a lot of urgency, because, as I'm sure we'll come to in later questions, I think that the idea of a GB national transportation system and access to GB hydrogen storage is absolutely essential to making the most of Scottish hydrogen potential.
A GB system, but maybe actually a European system?
No doubt it will link into that as well, yes, of course.
Thank you. Jan, please.
I've got nothing to add, as this is outside of my area of expertise, and would refer to Simon or perhaps Mark to add to that.
Thank you very much. Mark, please.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Simon. I think Simon phrased the problem there very well. And all I'll add is the importance of regulations and standards, not just in driving adoption, but also in driving public acceptance of hydrogen as well. So it's a really important question.
Thank you, and I think that's a very good point. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Kevin. The next questions come from Douglas.
Actually, Sarah.
Sorry, you're right. I double jumped. That's a mistake. Sarah, you get the next questions. You look very offended, and rightly so. Off you go.
Not at all. I'm delighted to come in and ask this question. I think one of the issues I was asking in the previous panel was about to what extent could Grangemouth play a key role in terms of green hydrogen production. RWE project was mentioned in the last panel, and it's just to get the panellists to say to what extent do you think it's a realistic option at Grangemouth. Kick off with you, Simon.
Yeah, absolutely. So the RWE project, it would be great to see that happen. But more generally, I think that whilst Grangemouth may be an excellent site to be a user of green hydrogen and to turn it into either to use it as part of its processes or turn it into some of the products that the Willow report talks about. What we really need is as I mentioned in the last question, large-scale hydrogen network transportation within Scotland and between Scotland and England and Wales, which would allow the location of green hydrogen production to be decoupled from where it's used. So my view is that the best thing is not to think about having to put all the green hydrogen production at Grangemouth, but to put it potentially further north in Scotland and to connect it to a pipeline that then goes via Grangemouth, and that allows for the development of a hydrogen market, which means that the hydrogen producers can sell to Grangemouth or they can sell to other users, and Grangemouth can access the lowest cost hydrogen from multiple providers. So once you have that in place, you start, I think, to have a system which can nationally help drive down the cost of hydrogen. So I think it's good that the Project Willow report thinks about green hydrogen production at Grangemouth. But I think in the bigger picture, we need to think about linking that up with other infrastructure.
Okay, I'll come back to that in a second. Other two witnesses, would you like to comment on this point?
Yes, I'll come in if I may. I think I definitely agree with Simon that we shouldn't just focus on just Grangemouth as being the point of production of green hydrogen. And of course, one of Grangemouth's benefits is that it can convert that green hydrogen using maybe some of the existing workforce and adaptations of existing facilities into other chemicals that we're more familiar with handling, such as, for example, more conventional fuels. But really, maybe one of the excellent things that Grangemouth can do is by acting as this hub for part production, but also for the onward conversion of hydrogen, it can really help drive innovation across the rest of the hydrogen sector in Scotland. So having that centralised hub, I think, is going to be really important.
Okay, that's really useful. And would you like to come in, Jan?
Just briefly, I mean, it's kind of obvious that Scotland is in a unique position when it comes to green hydrogen production, right? I mean, when you look at the availability of offshore wind in particular, but also onshore potentially, Scotland really is in a very unique position. And strategically, it makes a lot of sense to focus on green hydrogen production in Scotland. As to whether Grangemouth should be the only point of focus, certainly not. You know, the potential is much larger than just Grangemouth. But I would just underline that strategically Scotland is well positioned for green hydrogen production.
Right, that's very positive from all of you. And I particularly like the phrase about the innovation hub in terms of jobs and skills. That was mentioned by our last panel. Can I ask a bit more then about, in terms of Project Willow, how you would potentially use hydrogen on site at Grangemouth? The last panel talked about fertilisers, discussion of sustainable aviation fuels. I think, Simon, you talked about maritime fuels, transport strategy, industry. What would be your top priorities in terms of how you would use hydrogen at Grangemouth?
So I think the first, there's three things I'd say. First, decarbonise the industrial processes at Grangemouth. So where it's using grey hydrogen, use green hydrogen. Where it's using natural gas to heat things, unless it's very high temperature heat, use hydrogen. Second thing is aviation. Third thing is maritime fuel production. So it's interesting that in the 7th carbon budget, the CCC analysis suggested, compared with the 6th carbon budget, a significant reduction in hydrogen use within the GB economy. And that was due to kind of complete removal of hydrogen from some sectors, including heat and surface transport. A focus on sustainable aviation fuel for aviation. The CCC advice wasn't particularly clear on the production methodology for sustainable aviation fuel, and there's two there. There's a biogenic route, effectively from things like oil, used cooking oil, and there's a synthetic route which uses hydrogen combined with CO2 to synthesise the SAF. So I think you know, there will be a limit to the biogenic route for that. So if we want to keep flying and we want to do that in a low carbon way, we need to find a way to mass produce synthetic SAF, and I think that is a really important use of it. On maritime fuels, there's a range of technologies which could be used there, including methanol, which can be created from hydrogen as well, and ammonia. Now, again, the CCC analysis seems to suggest that most of the ammonia that we will end up using for our maritime sector, under their scenario, it's only one scenario, would be sourced from international markets. But I think there is an opportunity there to use somewhere like Grangemouth, making use of the otherwise curtailed wind power in Scotland and potentially low-cost production of hydrogen to create ammonia as a fuel. And I know there was some discussion in the last session about the kind of relative balance of the cost of that in Scotland compared with other areas. But I think that that is another opportunity. So decarbonise industrial processes, SAF, synthetic SAF, and thinking about maritime fuels.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that? Because for SAF, you've got both EU and UK are talking about scaling up of aviation.
Yeah.
And also there's discussion about maritime fuels. Does Grangemouth's location help, or does it matter? Because the other panel said it doesn't matter, you can just transport hydrogen. But does it matter in terms of the fact you've got major airports in Scotland and you've got, Grangemouth is potentially a port in terms of shipping? Is that going to be helpful, and is the big issue priority in terms of investment?
Yeah, so I think my view would be that it probably is valuable for it to be in a strategic location with access, it's a container shipping port already. It's got access to shipping potential and, like you say, close to airports. So I do think that's valuable. As I think one of the other witnesses said, also the ability to use the workforce is a really good thing, both from the technical expertise that this needs and from the social aspect of providing new jobs to replace the fossil fuel-based ones at Grangemouth. So I get the point, maybe, that what the previous panel was saying, but I do think there is value in the location that it's in.
Okay, thank you for that. Jan or Mark, would either of you want to come in on that? Do you agree with the broad picture that it's an economic opportunity, jobs, skills, location?
I just wanted to add to the end use. You started out, Sarah, I think, by asking a question about the best end users of hydrogen in that location. And I think one of the end users we haven't discussed yet is to use hydrogen to back up the electricity system. We're going to have to replace a lot of the gas plants in order to decarbonize. And I think that's where most experts see a significant role for hydrogen, because it can store energy over very long periods of time if stored correctly, which batteries can't and many other technologies can't. So there's a significant role there as well. I think in addition to aviation and shipping and replacing hydrogen used as feedstock for fertilizer production. So we'll just add that as a high priority end use to the list, and potentially that it's a significant end use. It's not going to produce the majority of electricity, but it's still a significant end use when you look at it in quantitative terms. And yeah, full agree with Simon on the use of hydrogen in buildings and transport, road transport, where the role is very, very limited in the UK, in my view, and the view of most other people who have looked at this.
Could I just ask a follow-up question? Because most of the focus on storage, we've got pumped hydro storage, but battery is the other example given. We've seen some problems with that, but hydrogen storage is not up there in the same profile. Do you want to say why that is, or why it needs to be given more profile?
Well, I think batteries can already sell into the wholesale market pretty easily, and basically make money by feeding electricity into the grid when prices are high. There isn't really a very good market mechanism that encourages the production of hydrogen for electricity generation, including the cost of storage. So we don't have a mechanism for long-term storage currently in the UK and in most other countries. This is a missing piece in the sort of market landscape, in my view.
Okay, that's really helpful comment. And Mark, have you got any suggestions on that issue?
Yeah, I'd like to come in and say something around synthetic aviation fuels and really maybe put in a context, maybe the scale of the opportunity here, because I think it very much is an opportunity for Grangemouth and Scotland in general. So I think it's useful for us to make a distinction between sustainable aviation fuels, SAFs, and then entirely synthetic aviation fuels. So sustainable aviation fuels could be made from biomass, for example, from hydrogenating that, which is one of the plans for Grangemouth. Synthetic aviation fuels, which is also one of the other plans, which would go via methanol, involves combining CO2 and hydrogen together to make methanol and then other jet fuels from there. To give you an idea of where we are at the moment, both the UK and the EU have sustainable aviation fuel mandates that will just take any sustainable aviation fuel, whether that's from biosources or directly synthetic from CO2, of having about 2% SAF. That's the current target. But these are going to ramp up pretty quickly. And if we look at the EU's numbers, these are especially interesting. So the EU is aiming that 70% of all the fuel that is consumed by jet aircraft will be sustainable aviation fuel by 2070. There probably isn't enough feedstock in the world to make all that from biologically available resources. And so they have a secondary target that 35% of the fuel they burn by 2050, which is only 25 years away, will be entirely synthetic. So this is made from CO2 and hydrogen using chemical processes. So that's about 15 million tonnes just for the EU's sustainable aviation use. So in that context, hydrogen, and particularly what we have at Grangemouth, could be really vital in providing that for export, but also for use indigenously. And you asked around Grangemouth's, it's the location. Is that an advantage? I think it definitely is in this case, particularly when we think around the innovation cycle and where we would start. We would start, presumably, quite small scale, supplying fuel to Edinburgh and Glasgow airports, which are very close by. And so that would be a way, certainly, to get that operation off the ground and rise through the technology readiness levels.
That's really helpful. I want to... Oh, got an additional comment from Simon?
I wanted to come in and add to some of the comments on storage. Is that okay to do now?
Yep, that'd be helpful.
Good. Right. So I think it's really important to set the context when we talk about energy storage in the energy system. So today we have access to 35 terawatt hours of natural gas storage, and we have 59 terawatt hours of energy stored in crude oil stocks and petroleum products. Okay, so we're up in the high tens of terawatt hours. The NIC, the National Infrastructure Commission, recommended 8 terawatt hours of hydrogen storage by 2035 and 25 terawatt hours of energy storage for electricity to provide resilience of supply. Crooken Pumped Storage, which is a brilliant and really important part of our electricity system, stores 0.007 terawatt hours. It is really important for our electricity system. I'm not making a point that we shouldn't be thinking about pumped storage, but in terms of the scale of energy storage that is currently in the form of fossil fuels, that we need to have in some form in low carbon, zero carbon options, is huge. And effectively, hydrogen and its derivatives are the main option for storing that. So it is really important. I think, as was it Jan said about the need for a mechanism for this, that is really important. The UK government has the hydrogen storage business model, which is one of the things that was in that hydrogen roadmap 18 months ago. We are expecting a consultation on what that will look like fairly soon, possibly over the summer, alongside the parallel hydrogen transport business model. And we expect that to start supporting hydrogen storage, probably in England, probably around the industrial clusters that are there already in the next wee while. But it's really important, I think, to set that scene and make sure we're talking the right scale when we come to this. And those numbers are in the paper that I shared on Friday.
Yeah, I think that's really useful, because I don't think the issue about storage is really on our agenda at that kind of scale. And I've certainly seen papers in terms of rail use of hydrogen in addition to sustainable aviation fuel. So it's clearly there as an issue. It's how you make that connection from theoretically this is important to actually delivering it. So I think the three of you have been very helpful in terms of how this needs to be clearly on the agenda and needs to happen. Appreciate that. Thank you. Commissioner.
Thank you. And Simon, I should have thanked you at the outset. I had a note too for your paper that you produced on Friday. Rude of me, but I hope you'll accept it now in the good faith it would have been delivered at the beginning if I'd remembered. Douglas, now I come to you.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Convener. The problem I have today is everything we've spoke about seems achievable. But how do we make the economics stack up with some of those things? I think, Jan, you mentioned, like SAF, for example. You know, how is the cost of SAF going forwards going to compare with what we're paying just now? Or maybe it was Mark, I can't remember, sorry. Mark, I'll come to you first.
Okay, thank you, Douglas. I did say some things around SAF. So certainly SAF is more expensive at the current time than conventional fuels. And what the EU are doing with their mandates is effectively they're creating a market for people to make synthetic fuels that are above the price of current fossil fuels by saying that basically they will only allow planes to fly if 70% of the fuel on board them has come from sustainable sources by 2070. So that sort of move away, that regulation, that law change, kind of, in a way, it takes economics out of it. And I think the idea behind that is that over the next few decades, synthetic fuel production will scale up to the kind of level where it will then be competitive with fossil fuel. So we will iron out the issues that we have now with efficiency, for example, around how those fuels are made, so that we can then make them at a price that's cost comparative with fossil fuels. A lot of the technology used to make, for example, synthetic aviation fuels is actually quite old. It's just not very efficient. So there's an argument to be made for innovation there that we could maybe increase the efficiency of that process and therefore decrease the cost of the fuel. But at the moment, that isn't taking place because there isn't a market for that fuel. But certainly, at least anecdotally, I've heard that airlines would pay maybe double what they currently pay for fossil fuel for SAFs if they were forced to do so. So there is some wiggle room, I think, around that.
And, you know, if I look at something else, you know, I think we mentioned, you know, in terms of the hydrogen cost, that's still a lot higher than what it is in other parts of the world. And I think 75% of that is due to electricity costs. So how, you know, when we look at the CFDs for floating offshore wind, for example, I think it was 155 megawatt hour pounds. So how is that going to come down when we've got a CFD that actually has that price up high? Maybe come to Simon on that one.
Yeah, so, price of electricity is really important, and I heard from the first session Nigel quoting about 70% of the cost of hydrogen is in electricity, which is more or less the same as what my analysis has suggested. You can then break that down in more or less, kind of in half. So about half of that is the wholesale cost of electricity, and about half of it is the electricity system costs. So the cost of the network, the cost of balancing the network, all those kind of other elements that we have to pay for. We have a big electricity infrastructure national network, so those costs account for about half of it. So there's some things that can drive down the cost of green hydrogen. So one of which is to try to find ways where it's appropriate to design the system so that hydrogen production doesn't face some of those system costs, particularly where it actually supports a more efficient electricity system. So at the moment, for example, hydrogen electrolyzers would pay a demand TNUoS cost. And I'm sure the members here are all familiar with the discussions on TNUoS, the transmission network use of system charges from the perspective of renewable generators, but it is also paid by demand consumers, including some industrial demand. Now, over the last year, we've had a policy introduced by UK government which has exempted them from 60% of that TNUoS if you are counted as an energy-intensive industry. So that has dropped down some of the costs, but there's still significant costs in there. But actually, electrolysers located in Scotland, particularly when they're operating in a way that's aligned with wind generation, reduce the pressure on the electricity transmission system. And so there is an argument that they should receive a significant negative cost or a payment, which would then align with the way that we treat wind farms located in the south of England, where we actually pay them through the TNUoS system. So you've got these kind of system effects which can help do it. And the second element is in relation to the wholesale cost of energy. So as I think Jan mentioned earlier, the price of gas sets the electricity system price during large parts of the year, but increasingly renewables will set the price during large parts of the year, and that will force the wholesale price down pretty close to zero during some hours. So we had 155 hours last year of effectively zero or negative priced electricity in the wholesale market. That's likely to increase significantly as we continue to build out renewables. So if you design your electrolyser to operate flexibly and to be capable of turning on when there's excess renewables, either across GB or behind the transmission constraint in Scotland, then you start to be able to access very low wholesale cost electricity. So you've got those two components. You can reduce your wholesale cost by careful, targeted operation of your electrolyser, and through policy arrangements, you can maybe reduce the electricity system costs as well. If you combine that with scaling up electrolysers, you, I think, can make a significant impact on the cost.
And I guess this is where I get confused. If I'm a wind farm operator, I've got a CFD for £155 per megawatt hour, but the wholesale price is low. So where's
that come from?
Yeah.
So if you have a CFD at £100 a megawatt hour, the price clears at £10 a megawatt hour. The market pays you £10, and then GB consumers collectively pay you the other £90 through a kind of a sort of outside the market system. Okay, it's called the levy, the energy levy. By contrast, if the price is £150 a megawatt hour, you pay, as the wind farm, you pay £50 back to GB consumers collectively. So that you've got this kind of extra system that works around the outside of the wholesale market. But if you're a wholesale market consumer, like an electrolyser, you're actually focused on the actual price. So in the first example I gave, you'd be getting £10 a megawatt hour electricity. And the additional money to the wind farm would be coming from a flat levy on all GB consumers.
Which is basically a subsidy, really, to the...
In that hour, it would be a subsidy, yes. Increasingly, we'll see what happens with the next round of CFD prices, but with some of the lower CFD prices that we've had in recent auctions, a lot of the time the electricity price will be above the strike price, and you actually get a kind of it's more of a hedge, I would call it, for both generators and consumers.
But the CFD prices for offshore wind, floating offshore wind in particular, doesn't seem to be coming down. You know, the last round it went up significantly because there was no takers the round before.
Yes.
So I'm still struggling to understand how we're going to get the price of electricity down when we're moving more to renewables, and how are we going to get the price of hydrogen down to be competitive with some other countries?
Yeah. Ultimately, energy isn't a cheap commodity, and the sorts of things that I'm talking about here are kind of effectively trying to move the costs around between different actors within the system. But ultimately, although renewables don't take anything to run once you build them, they've got huge capital investment costs which have to be recouped over 15, 20, 25 years. So it's not like the quantity of energy is cheap, and that's a kind of a fact that we can't kind of work around. It will be equally true in other countries, and you need to think about the amount of tax-based subsidy that you give to the system, the amount of bills-based subsidy you give to the system, which groups of consumers you kind of target those on, and those kind of elements, as well as thinking about what actually kind of makes up your, the underlying cost base, I suppose.
Okay. Anybody else want to come in at all, or no?
Just come in.
Just quickly, if I could. Sorry.
I was going to say I thought Mark put his hand up, but Jan, you're heading off.
Apologies, Mark. I didn't see your hand.
No, it's your hand, Jan. It's your hand.
Is it?
So polite, the both of you.
I keep it very short. Because I think the question is a good one. And what I observe is that often there are subsidies on offer to encourage the production of green hydrogen or blue hydrogen in many different countries around the world. But the problem then is on the demand side, even after those subsidies are taken into account, well, the alternatives, which are often fossil fuels, are still cheaper, and therefore why should end-use sectors adopt hydrogen? And that is still an issue that needs to be tackled, and you could do it with quotas and regulation. You can, I think the example was used of forcing the airlines to use an increasing share of SAF or other fuels that are low carbon or zero carbon, or you pay them, you offer them incentives to do it. But at the moment, I think that hasn't been solved yet, and we've seen projects struggling to find off-takers all around the world as a result of that. So there's a demand-side question. I think that's quite important. It's not just a question of bringing down the cost of hydrogen, but also making sure the demand side actually is either required to some degree or incentivized to use hydrogen or its derivatives.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. So, I hope I've got this right. Mark, I think you're next.
So thanks for the session's been really enlightening so far, and I wanted to sort of focus back in on sectors again, because we've already had some discussion about sustainable aviation fuel, about thermal generation as backup, and the role of hydrogen in relation to that. But I wanted to take you back to the questions I was asking the first panel about the hydrogen ladder or the hydrogen hierarchy, and whether you think there are particular sectors within that hierarchy where it makes sense to be focusing investment, whether there are sectors where there are some challenges. So in particular, we talked about domestic heating, where that sits, and I'm interested in what the international picture is in relation to some of those sectors as well. I think I'll start online, and I'll go to Jan first.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, this is a great question, and it's a complicated question. There is a great new paper that was just published, I think, 2 weeks ago. If the committee could take a look at that, I would encourage that, which takes a pretty deep dive into that question. What are the most appropriate end users? What are the economics? What are the alternatives? And I think we touched on this already before. The sort of high priority end users clearly seem to be around replacing existing hydrogen use, especially in fertilizer production, but also in refining, and then using hydrogen or its derivatives in shipping and aviation, and for long-term storage for the electricity system. The end users that in the past were promoted quite heavily, hydrogen cars or heating homes with hydrogen, I think the evidence there is now pretty robust that that is an unlikely path in the majority of countries, unless you have very specific conditions, very cold climates, for example, such as they have in Canada. You might need to think about hybrid systems, district heating systems where you are maybe co-located with hydrogen production already. So why not use some of that hydrogen waste heat from the electrolyzers, or indeed use some peaker plants that operate on hydrogen to feed into those systems. But the evidence, I think, is now pretty clear that we're probably not going to see a lot of hydrogen cars. Just looking at the figures in terms of sales, I think we're approaching a world where 20% or so of new car sales are electric. When you look at the latest stats for hydrogen vehicles, it's less, I think, than the number of Ferraris that have been sold last year. So there's some really question marks whether they can ever catch up, I think, with electrification of road transport. And for home heating, it's very similar. There are now more than 200 million heat pumps installed globally. The number of hydrogen boilers is minuscule, and the trials that have been proposed, many of those have been cancelled, not just in the UK, but also elsewhere. So I think the consensus is relatively strong now, what the highest and best use cases are, but it's also quite clear, and I think Simon commented on the CCC's report, that in personal road transport and home heating, where you have a potentially very large use, the use case is becoming increasingly weak, and indeed the NIC, the National Infrastructure Commission, has taken a very similar view, similar to the IEA, the IPCC, the European Commission, the UK Energy Research Centre. I could list many more organisations that have come to that conclusion.
So where is the incentive then to invest in more kind of pilot projects? I mean, you'll be aware of the H100 project that we have in Fife, in my region, in Leven, which is attempting, I guess, to prove a proof of concept kind of project. Are we at a point where we kind of know a lot about hydrogen for home heating now. And is there a need to continue to kind of look at these areas and continue to do pilot projects, or we got some quite firm conclusions now internationally about their applicability, where it does make sense, where it doesn't make sense?
I would say yes. I think the evidence is pretty clear. So I'm aware of more than 60 independent studies not funded by industry that have been published over the last 5 years or so, and none of them suggest that there's a significant role of hydrogen in heating, unless the evidence dramatically changes, which is unlikely given the underlying physics and just the efficiency of hydrogen production. I think that evidence is pretty robust. I mean, we might need to reassess that if the cost of hydrogen decline very dramatically, unexpectedly, but that doesn't look particularly likely given in the last few years hydrogen costs have not come down by as much as people were hoping. So I think the international evidence is strong, and it's probably a better use of effort, resources to focus on those really high use cases where there are fewer alternatives, and it's absolutely clear that we're going to need a lot of hydrogen for those use cases.
Okay. Simon, come back to you in the room.
Yes, so I agree with Jan's points and the areas of focus. I think just to add, are there any other areas that I think are important? I mean, another area that's maybe a slightly niche area, probably quite small demand, but potentially important, is off-road vehicles. So I think that's one of the only areas where the CCC think that there might be a niche role for hydrogen. So things like, I suppose, quarry trucks and big, large-scale vehicles that you might struggle to electrify. But beyond that, I think it's the sectors that we've talked about. I think I've mentioned storage. I think very much related to that is resilience, is energy resilience. And I think hydrogen plays a really important role in energy resilience, resilience that we currently get from fossil fuel sources. And I think that's an area where energy system modelers, on the whole, are maybe slightly weak. So I put a lot of sort of trust in the work that the CCC does. You know, I don't necessarily think everything they say is actually going to happen, but if they say something like there's not going to be any hydrogen in domestic heating, I think that's worth thinking about quite deeply, because they have thought quite deeply about it. But there's maybe a wee bit of a missing piece in terms of the resilience piece. Now, the NIC, I think, are the organisation in GB, in the UK, which are, or were, until they've been subsumed into the kind of wider body in the last few months, very good on resilience, which is, I think, why in their recommendations in the second National Infrastructure Assessment, they had a greater sort of emphasis and scale on things like hydrogen storage than the CCC's equivalent kind of modelling. So beyond what we've said already, I think that would be my additional point to say energy resilience is a really important role that hydrogen can play.
Okay. And that's in the context of society becoming increasingly electrified with both transport and heating.
Yes.
And therefore needing a backup system effectively to release that energy during winter or any other time when demand is high. Is that?
Yes. So there's that national societal piece. I also think, and this is a question I don't know the answer to, where you have industry which absolutely requires kind of baseload industrial processes, it feels to me that there may be an important thing to think about there in terms of how those specific sites, for example, roll through an event similar to what we had in Spain, for example. So if you have a national blackout, how do you kind of deal with processes, industrial processes, which really need to carry on? Now, if you've not got electricity supply, one option is that all those sites have electrical batteries on site. That could be quite expensive. Hydrogen storage might be an alternative way to provide that resilience on a site-by-site basis, as well as on a national basis. So there's maybe kind of at least two contexts where you might think about that.
Okay. Mark, do you want to chip in on this particular question? Or?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Actually, I think this is a really important question as to where and how we use the hydrogen. And you referred to that hydrogen use ladder, things like fertilizers, aviation fuel, shipping, actually all the things that we're talking about right now. And from Grangemouth's perspective, these are, of course, all things that would be made in sort of centralised facilities. And I think that plays well into the idea that we would have this industrial hub. Also, I think it plays into two other things, that one of which I've raised and one of which I will raise now. The first is public acceptance of hydrogen. And I think if you're using hydrogen in a sort of a centralised facility with experts using it, a lot of the concerns the public might have around hydrogen use domestically go away. But secondly, also, there is what's called fugitive emissions. So I think in the first panel you heard about hydrogen slipperiness. So as a molecule, it's very small. It tends to leak out of places. This isn't necessarily an issue, but what this does mean is we end up with effectively hydrogen pollution. Now, hydrogen isn't a greenhouse gas itself, but it does interfere with processes in the atmosphere that lead, to example, to the breakdown of methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So if we do have lots of emissions of hydrogen from leaks, that could actually act as an agent of global warming by basically prolonging the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere. And so again, having centralised facilities where we could perhaps better control and better monitor those leaks could be an advantage, and maybe therefore the role that hydrogen plays is as a way of making things that we're already used to using, such as hydrocarbons and ammonia and things like that.
Thank you very much. That's really useful.
Okay, thanks, Mark. The next questions come from the Deputy Convener, Michael Matheson. Michael.
Good morning. I want to turn to the issue about the export potential of hydrogen from Scotland, particularly green hydrogen, which is obviously an area which the Scottish Government have given emphasis to in their previous hydrogen action plan. I wonder if you could, I'd be interested in getting your views on what you think the potential is for the export market in green hydrogen, and what role you think Scotland can play in that market, particularly at a European level. Simon.
Yes, so I know that there has been some work done on a pipeline, sort of like scoping out what might happen with the pipeline between Scotland and Europe, and some work looking at the relative economics of hydrogen production in Scotland versus hydrogen production elsewhere. My understanding is that Scotland could be cost competitive if we were to make an early start on that, getting hydrogen produced in Scotland, getting a pipeline built across the North Sea and feeding into markets for the use of hydrogen, which appear to be developing a bit faster than they are in GB, particularly Germany. So on a purely economic basis, there seems to be a case for it, but it's one that we need to get on with. I think there is the risk that we will face stiff competition from places in the south of Europe and maybe North Africa, where the production of green hydrogen from solar power could be significantly cheaper even than our cheap, if it is cheap, wind power in Scotland. So that needs to be taken account of. And of course, one of the big things is that depends on a centralised, probably strongly government-supported pipeline investment between Scotland and elsewhere. So you've got to, I suppose, you've got quite a lot that needs to happen around it to realise that. The other option is that as we develop a GB-wide pipeline system for hydrogen, a transmission network, that effectively we could think about Scotland exporting to Europe via England and via interconnectors that connect further south, much in the same way that the natural gas system works today. Ultimately, that feels like a more likely scenario to me, but it's also a much longer term scenario. And I would imagine that developing up that national hydrogen core network within GB and then connecting through to Europe is probably something that's looking to the early 2040s rather than any earlier date.
Okay. I don't know whether Jan or Mark want to come in that particular issue.
Not me.
No. Do you think that export potential, given that it appears that some mainland European countries are slightly further ahead of us in developing this, particularly around Germany. Do you think that that export potential is likely to be a key driver in the growth of the green hydrogen sector in Scotland? And if so, do you think it will be to a greater extent than demand at a domestic level?
My view is that the best option for Scotland is probably the GB domestic market, not just the Scottish domestic market, but that depends on that pipeline infrastructure within GB that I've talked about. Now, there is a risk that that develops slowly or it doesn't develop at all. It's in the hands of UK government and the National Energy System operator, effectively. Ideally, that would develop during the early 2030s, commissioning up fully within the late 2030s, providing confidence for green hydrogen providers to connect into that network and therefore access that GB demand and then potentially onto Europe from further south. But there is a risk there. And there is a risk that I think Scottish Government and Scotland should think about in terms of what happens if that doesn't kind of come to pass, or it doesn't come to pass as quickly as we would like it to. I think there's real issues for the offshore wind, for the wind sector in Scotland, associated with the ability to get its energy out of Scotland. At the moment, it obviously depends entirely on the electricity transmission network and interconnectors, and the only interconnector Scotland has is to Northern Ireland at the moment. So I do think it's important to think about that. I guess, you know, the economics appears to be in the balance as far as I can tell. I'm slightly sceptical about how easy it will be to realise that. But it's certainly something we should be continuing to develop up plans for and think about in light of what else is happening and the direction of travel from UK government and NISO.
Okay. And my final question to each of you is, where do you think the hydrogen sector will be in the next 10 years? Mark, do you want to start?
Great, thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think really we're at a crossroads here now. We can basically decide as a society that we're going to invest in hydrogen as China invested in batteries 15 or 20 years ago, and we could turn the UK or indeed Scotland into a powerhouse for hydrogen innovation, for production, use, storage, conversion. Or, and I genuinely think this, we could sit back and say we think this is too expensive right now, and watch other people take up the mantle. I think from a fundamental resource point of view, we have everything we need here in Scotland to generate large volumes of hydrogen if we invest in the renewable energy sector and if we invest in ways of converting that. I think export of hydrogen is probably more likely to happen and be more valuable in the form of things like sustainable aviation fuels. I'm going out there a bit now and stating my opinion, but I guess this is what you wanted to hear. So I think those liquid fuels will be where the main profit is. And I think we have an opportunity now, through decisions that this committee might make, to really set the tone for how the hydrogen sector develops in Scotland over the next decade or so.
Okay, thanks. Jan?
I think a lot of it will depend on what we do on the demand side. I said this before, but I think I just say it again. It's going to be important to think of the hydrogen economy that hopefully will be created, not just from a production perspective, but really think through how to stimulate the uptake on the demand side. And if we can get that right, there could be a very buoyant market. There could be a vibrant hydrogen industry. But if we don't do that, I fear that we're not going to see the uptake that should be possible and is required to reach that zero. So I think a much more granular debate about how we build markets for long-term storage, for example. How do we get sustainable fuels derived from hydrogen into the market is required. And I think that is an area where I would love to see more action and more political engagement from governments.
Simon?
So I'll answer the question in a slightly different way by saying I think we absolutely need a strong green hydrogen sector or evolving green hydrogen sector by the mid-2030s. And the reason I say that is that we are now putting a lot of focus on decarbonising electricity fully through Clean Power 2030, which is a very good, strong push to kind of take that forward. But effectively what it's doing is it's drawing forward the development of electricity renewable generation ahead of the creation of new electrified demand. So we will end up in a situation in the early 2030s where we have even more of an excess of renewables than maybe we would have been expecting without Clean Power 2030. And that means we really need to focus on ways to use that electricity. And green hydrogen is one of the most important ways to take electrical energy, turn it into a different form and use it in some of the sectors that we've been talking about today. Obviously, Scotland needs to be at the forefront of that because we already experience most of the curtailment. So last year we had 4 terawatt-hours of curtailment of Scottish wind power. If you look at National Grid NESO's numbers in their scenarios, by 2035, they kind of expect us to have about 60 terawatt-hours of curtailment. So there's a huge amount of energy that if we don't get on and electrify things and develop a hydrogen economy and green hydrogen, that, you know, there's a huge amount of energy that won't be used efficiently. So I think we absolutely must. And my concern is that with the focus on Clean Power 2030, some of these slightly longer term issues get slightly put on the back burner, and we don't really have time to do that because it does take a decade or more to get these kind of infrastructures up and going.
Okay. Thanks.
Mark, I think you had a quick question on markets.
Yes, I just want to go back to the issue of the export market to EU countries. And, you know, I suppose it's about the status of blue hydrogen within that mix. If blue hydrogen is going for export, you know, will there be countries that want to buy that? Does it have integrity as a low-carbon form of hydrogen, or is the market already kind of shifting, the market rules already shifting towards green? So there's a question about how long that blue hydrogen market for export will exist, and does it have integrity now? Will it continue to have integrity in the future? I think everybody's nodding, so go to Simon first.
I wonder if I might pass to one of the others.
Right, I'll go to Jan and then Mark.
The trouble is, if you both look away or don't say anything, then we have to nominate somebody. And a press person is not as good as a volunteer. So who'd like to volunteer?
It works now. Sorry, I was on mute. No, just very quickly. I mean, clearly green hydrogen can always be sold regardless of what the rules are, right? Because it's zero carbon. I think there are more risks associated with rules changing in Europe and becoming more stringent if you go down the blue hydrogen route. But what we're seeing right now is that there has been a bit of a shift in Europe in terms of just the language and what the potential standards could be, that is more open also to blue hydrogen and not just solely focused on green. But it highly depends, of course, on how those standards change going forward, and green seems to be the less riskier option.
Okay. And Mark?
Yeah, I think I would agree with what Jan said. From a chemical point of view, blue hydrogen and green hydrogen are the same. So provided you've stored your CO2 effectively from your blue hydrogen, there should be no environmental issues with that. But of course, we don't know going forward what regulation will bring in or what the public will think about blue hydrogen, whether they think green hydrogen is preferred.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to the panel for attending this morning and giving evidence. And again, Simon, thank you for your paper, which was interesting. We'll discuss this more as a committee in the private part of the meeting later on, and again next week when we've got 2 more panels on green hydrogen and one on blue hydrogen and carbon capture, which will be interesting. Now, I'm going to briefly suspend the meeting, and I would ask committee members to be back here by 12:10 so we can move on with the next part of it. But that will allow Simon to leave. Thank you very much, and I suspend the meeting. consent notification relating to a proposed statutory instrument, the Persistent Organic Pollutants Amendment Number 3 Regulation 2025. These regulations would remove 2 persistent organic pollutants from the list of those to be eliminated. This is due to the certain uses of these chemicals relating to medical technology having come to light. On the 22nd of April, the Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero Energy notified the proposed instrument to the committee. It involves the UK government is seeking the Scottish Government's consent to do so. The committee's role is to decide whether it agrees with the Scottish Government's proposal to consent to the UK Government making these regulations within the devolved competence and in the manner that the UK Government has indicated to the Scottish Government. If members are content for consent to be given, the committee will write to the Scottish Government accordingly. In writing to the Scottish Government, we have the option to draw various matters to the Government's attention and pose questions or ask them to be kept up to date on relevant developments. If the committee is not content with the proposal, however, we may make one of the 2 recommendations outlined in the clerk's note. And now, I wonder if any members have any views on this. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, convener. Looking at my notes here, I would just note that the 2 chemicals in question, do have an impact in terms of human health and environmental health. So UV328, toxic for mammals, dangerous for human health, can create, damage to liver and kidney. Dechlorane, affects the nervous system of aquatic animals. So it is right that these chemicals are being phased out. I accept the government's approach here. And the representations that have been made by medical industries, but I also note that these 2 chemicals will be prohibited in the EU in autumn 2025. So I'm content to accept this SI, but I would like to find out on the back of this whether these will be phased out with a similar timescale to the phase out that's taking place in Europe at the moment, particularly given that they are chemicals that have an impact on the environment. They do have an impact on human health, and it's the right thing to phase them out.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Does anyone else have any comments? So, we could easily write as part of this to the Scottish Government asking and posing those questions. But if we're writing to them, we're also going to have to give them an answer to the substantive question, which is the committee content that the provisions set out in the notification should be made in the proposed UK statutory instrument? And it appears that we are agreed that that's it. So we'll write to them and say that, and we'll also write to them and ask them to notify us of when they ask them to tell us when they propose to eventually ban these instruments. So move on to agenda item 4, and this is the consideration of another Type 1 consent notification, this time relating to the proposed UK statutory instrument, the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Amendment Regulations 2025. These regulations would make 2 key changes to the existing provision on extended producer responsibility for waste electrical and electronic equipment. It would first extend the term producer to include online marketplaces. It would also create a new category of equipment for vapes and electronic cigarettes to ensure that producers of these are responsible for the waste disposal costs. On the 22nd of April, the Acting Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero and Energy notified the committee of the key proposed UK SI. As with the last item, the key issue is whether we agree with the Scottish Government that the UK Government should legislate in this devolved area in this way. Now, if we're content, we can, for the consent to be given, the committee will write to the Scottish Government accordingly. We have the option to pose questions or to take up any issue as far as date and relevant developments. And so my first question is, does any members have any views on this? No. So are we moving to the substantive question for this now? Is the committee content that the provision set out in the notification should be made in the proposed UK statutory instrument? We are agreed. Thank you. We'll write to the Scottish Government to that effect. The next item of business is the consideration of petition P2123 submitted by Asthma and Lung UK Scotland. The petition asks for the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to amend the Air Quality Standards Scotland Regulations 2010. The petitioner wants new limits to be set for nitrogen dioxide and fine particulate matter in order to align with the World Health Organisation's 2021 air quality guidelines. The committee first considered the petition on the 1st of April and agreed to write to the Scottish Government to get an update on its review of the Clean Air for Scotland 2 strategy. The Scottish Government responded on the 22nd of April and the letter is provided as Annex B of the paper. The paper also sets out some options to go further, it really, I think, highlights in that. I wondered if any members have any views on this. I'll take Sarah first. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I think this is an important issue in terms of people's quality of life and health. And I also note the fact that we've now got a response from the Scottish Government. I was wondering, given the importance of this petition, whether it's possible to write to stakeholders who were involved in that last inquiry that your committee did a couple of years ago and just get an update to see if there's any more thoughts they have, so that could then let us think about how to take this forward or whether we've got enough information. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Mark, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I would welcome that. I mean, since we last took evidence on this issue, which was in May 2023, you know, we have seen quite a few changes coming through. We've had the rollout of LEZs in Scotland, increasing evidence around wood-burning stoves, for example, around particulates. There's been, you know, some new scientific evidence coming along around the impacts of air pollution on child development. So I think you know, now would be a good time to kind of reflect on that evidence. Yeah, I mean, I think writing out to the stakeholders that were part of that initial inquiry would be a good time to take stock at this point.
Okay, yeah. So thank you for that, Mark. I think, therefore, what we're agreeing as a committee to do is to write back to those people that were involved in the 2023 report on air quality. Now, what I would like to do is just consider carefully the list of people that we should write to make sure that we've got it. And what we'll do is the clerks will circulate that list to committee members so we can actually agree that post this meeting, and then depending on what we get back from that, we can decide what next action we'll take. So if we're agreed, I think that's the simple simple solution to that. And thank you, Sarah, for suggesting that, and Mark for agreeing that. We are now going to move it into private session, so we will do that.